Chapter 1338. Li Nanheng hugged her and was about to kiss her when the phone in the room suddenly rang. He paused and felt the warm and fragrant jade in his arms. He panted heavily, and his black eyes locked onto Feng Ling's face. She seemed to be still in a daze, but because of the ringing of the phone, her eyes instantly regained clarity. She quickly pressed her hands on his shoulders and quickly stepped back to stand up. Li Nanheng let out a long breath. His handsome face was extremely dark at this moment. He picked up the phone and said grumpily, "Speak." The resort staff on the other end of the line could hear the unfriendliness in his tone. She was stunned for a moment and immediately said carefully, "Li, Mr. Li, the food and red wine in your room are ready. Should I send it over now? Or do you want to come out to the restaurant to eat?" Hearing the word red wine, the displeasure in Li Nanheng's eyes lessened. "Send it over." "All right, I'll send it over right away. Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Li." The other party carefully hung up the phone. Li Nanheng hung up the phone at the same time and let out a sigh of relief. He lowered his head to look at the place where he was still arrogant and turned to look behind him. He saw that Feng Ling had gone to the clothes again as though nothing had happened. She picked up the ironing machine, turned on the switch, and lowered her head to continue ironing. She didn't run. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and hid the slight surprise in his eyes. He turned back to the bathroom and simply washed his face with cold water. A few minutes later, someone knocked on the door. Yu Zheng came over with the staff who delivered the food. The staff pushed the dining cart with dishes that Li Nanheng and Feng Ling liked to eat. At the same time, it suited their tastes. There were also 2 bottles of red wine that were more than 9 years old. If they wanted red wine that was older, they would have to order more than 9 years old. This was not bad either. Li Nanheng nodded, indicating that they could leave. The staff member and Yu Zheng did not dare to look at Feng Ling. They all lowered their heads and silently retreated. Li Nanheng glanced at the dining cart again. "After all, we've lived together for too many years. Only you and I understand each other's taste so well." Feng Ling had just turned off the ironing machine and picked up the iron clothes. Hearing his words, she raised her eyes to look over. When she saw the food on the dining car, she understood what he was talking about. "Didn't you say you wanted to eat together? We have to eat something that both you and I can eat." She didn't avoid the topic and turned to hang up the clothes again. "It's ironed. Try it on the next time you wear it. If you can still wear it, then wear it. If you can't, then dispose of it. You ironed it yourself. Even if I can't wear it, I have to wear it." The man pushed the dining cart to the dining table and placed the dishes on the table one by one. Feng Ling went over to help. After putting it away, Li Nanheng opened a bottle of red wine. In order not to let Feng Ling notice his intention to get her drunk, he poured her a small glass and said, "Try it. How does it taste?" Feng Ling saw that the red wine was only at the bottom of the glass, so she picked it up and drank it. After tasting it, she said, "It's very delicious." "Really?" Li Nanheng poured himself a glass and tasted it. It was indeed not bad. He asked her, "Do you want more?" Feng Ling glanced at him. "You ordered 2 bottles and asked me if I wanted more." The man smiled, but he smiled because this girl would never escape his trap. He poured her more than half a glass and carefully reminded her, "Drink slowly. Don't drink too fast." Feng Ling did not speak. She sat down and picked up the cutlery. Without saying much, she ate as though she was about to leave. Li Nanheng did not say much. The entire dinner was very peaceful. The dishes tasted good, and the taste was what both of them liked. Li Nanheng drank a lot of the 2 bottles of wine. Feng Ling saw that he did not seem drunk. With his alcohol tolerance, it was indeed not easy for him to get drunk. But her alcohol tolerance was. However, this wine was really delicious. Although her alcohol tolerance was not good, the more she tried to control herself from drinking, the more she couldn't control herself when she encountered such delicious red wine. Li Nanheng knew that Feng Ling's alcohol tolerance was not good, so he did not urge her to drink. He just sat there and drank slowly. During this period, Feng Ling also poured 2 glasses for herself. After 2 glasses, she seemed to be controlling herself and did not touch it for a long time. However, seeing that Li Nanheng had drunk more than half of the wine, She couldn't help but pour another glass and sip slowly. She was like a child who knew that she could not eat too much sugar, but was afraid that it would be bad to eat too much, so she could only take small bites. She was so cute that Li Nanheng felt his heart ache. In the end, Feng Ling almost drank half of the 2 bottles of wine. She realized that she had drunk a lot. The bottle of red wine was not small, and the capacity was not small. She immediately put down the wine glass and did not dare to touch it again. She turned to drink the soup. Li Nanheng sat quietly opposite her. He had been eating and drinking well. He just looked at her quietly. Feng Ling's face turned red. She suddenly put down the cutlery, stood up and said, "I'm done eating. I'm going back." Li Nanheng still sat in his original position. He crossed his arms and quietly watched her turn to walk out. The direction of her walking was very accurate, directly toward the door. Her steps were very steady, but the video was a little straight. The man raised his eyebrows. "Feng Ling, N." Feng Ling did not look back, nor did she stop walking. She was almost at the door. "How old are you this year?" the man suddenly asked. Feng Ling was about to leave, but she was suddenly stumped by his question. She immediately stopped in her tracks, as though she was seriously recalling how old she was. Seeing that she was drunk again, the smile on Li Nanheng's lips deepened. He stood up and slowly walked over. Standing behind her, he lowered his eyes to watch her deep in thought, and then looked at her clear eyes that were staring straight at the wall. 20. Feng Ling thought seriously for a long time. 23 or 24. "Anne, it's going to be my 24th birthday soon," the man said softly. "So don't give me the cold shoulder anymore. Let's spend the rest of our lives together. What do you think?" Feng Ling stood there for a long time, put down her hand, and did not speak. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and glanced at her again, only to see that the little woman suddenly turned to look at him with a displeased expression. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows at her dazed but bright eyes. "What's wrong? I'm not giving you the cold shoulder." Chapter 1339. "Oh, I'm just angry. And then when will you calm down?" The drunk little woman turned her head proudly. "I don't know. Anyway, I haven't calmed down yet." Li Nanheng smiled and touched her fair little face. "You've been angry for long enough. At that time, I just wanted to resolve the matter as soon as possible. I didn't expect that I would end the battle quickly and hurt you badly. I also blame myself, but didn't I come out with you now?" Feng Ling ignored him. Li Nanheng still touched her face. "Tell me, what do I have to do to appease your anger?" Feng Ling stood there without moving, but she lowered her head slightly. No one knew what she was thinking. Seeing her seriously thinking, Li Nanheng stroked her chin with his hand and stood in front of her, blocking her way. At the same time, he felt it was funny. After Feng Ling was drunk, as long as she did not fall asleep, she usually looked the same as when she was sober. But in fact, every time her eyes and her state were obviously different. For example, her sharp eyes were very quiet and peaceful at this time. They were not dull, but they seemed to have returned to her own nature. They were very quiet, and her expression was also not aggressive. She would look at him and blink at him, although she would lose her temper sometimes. At least she would not pretend to be cold to him, especially when Feng Ling's eyes were open, because her eyes were clear and bright. Her pupils were black and bright, and her gaze was often cold. People liked to look at her. However, when she closed her eyes, the outline of her face became much gentler, as though she was a little fairy who had fallen asleep, quiet and clear as though she could not be violated by anyone. But the more he thought of Feng Ling when she was drunk, especially that time in Cambodia, that time, Li Nanheng seemed to have an indescribable excitement in his heart. For some reason, he had a premonition that he would be able to see the cute side of Feng Ling again. He pulled her back to the sofa, and then sat next to her, patiently waiting for her to say a way to appease her anger. But it wasn't easy for Feng Ling to sit so obediently next to him. It was absolutely impossible for him to do nothing. He had to do something to make him happy. He reached out to hold her in his arms, but Feng Ling sat there without moving, as if still trying to think of a way to appease her. After a long while, when the man leaned close to her ear and kissed her earlobe, she said softly, "It's really hard to survive in the business world. I don't think I'm suitable for this circle. Although the phone corporation can be maintained, it's not easy to maintain outside, especially when it comes to financing. It's very difficult. How hard is it? Li Nanheng gently patted her shoulder and lowered his eyes to look at the little woman, who was obediently held in his arms. Seeing that she did not resist and let him do whatever he wanted, he smiled. I can learn a lot of business knowledge and learn how to manage a company, but I can't learn how to smile at others, nor can I learn how to interact with others. I heard that some partners like to touch their female partner's buttocks, Feng Ling said seriously. Although I've never seen such a scene, nor have I seen it at Jinwan's place. Jinwan's EQ is very high. She usually avoids such things, and she won't cooperate with those partners who have bad habits. But she has the capital, but I don't. Even if I know that the partner has bad intentions, I have to come to talk about financing. But I'm already here, but I can't put down my face and keep smiling. I think it's really difficult. With that, Feng Ling turned to look at him, her eyes filled with grievance. You shouldn't have let me leave the base. I don't have a way back now. I don't like to work in the business circle. I want to be myself. Li Nanheng's handsome and cold brows moved. He patted her shoulder and gently stroked her head. If he hadn't seen through everything, he wouldn't have rushed over to accompany her to Washington. I know, but the Feng family can't be destroyed. I know, but the Feng family can't be destroyed. This is your only home. Your parents are not here. If you're not willing to bear these burdens, I can accompany you. You only need to bear the title of the Feng Corporation and name. I can help you with everything, but you're not willing. Feng Linger said. The man patiently whispered in her ear. It's not too late now. As long as you're willing to nod, I can help you take over everything you don't like. You can still be yourself. No one will dare to force you, including me. But Grandpa and Grandma have high hopes for me. Feng Ling lowered her eyes. They're like you. They hope that I can be the towering tree of the Feng family. You can think of it this way. I have high hopes for you to support the Feng family with your own ability. But if you change your way of thinking and find a good husband with your own ability, and your husband accompanies you and helps you, the result will be the same, won't it? The two of them won't be disappointed. At the same time, they'll be very happy to be able to solve your life's biggest problem. The man persuaded her. Feng Ling was in a daze. Do you understand what I'm saying? Li Nanheng asked by her ear with a smile in his eyes. Feng Ling did not nod or shake her head. She just sat there quietly. Li Nanheng continued to lean close to her and said, Think about it. As long as the two of us get married, the Feng family and the Li family will be truly connected. With the Li family around, who dares to do anything to the Feng family? Who dares to ask you to smile at those partners who have bad habits? With me around you, a tree can still grow strong and healthy. You can clearly be in front of me, basking in the sunlight, but you have to be angry at me. You have to grow in the cold and gloomy canyon by yourself. Don't you feel tired? It's not that you can't go back to 11 base. It's just that you don't have that title anymore. Didn't I ask you to participate in the battle last time, when Jinwan was in trouble? You're no different from the people in the base. I'm doing everything for you. Can't you feel sorry for me? Why do you always leave me hanging like this? I've never treated any woman like this in my King life. Ugh. Feng Ling abruptly raised her hand to cover his mouth. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows and looked at her. When he said that she was wrong, and that she was ignoring him, she refused to listen. She was so drunk, yet she still refused to listen to what she didn't want to hear. She even reached out to cover his mouth to stop him from speaking. What was wrong with him to have loved this evil woman for so many years? Chapter 1340. Li Nanheng took a deep breath in her palm. The pent-up emotions that he had been tortured by this woman for so many years suddenly surged up. She was bad, but he was worse than her. And so, Feng Ling trembled when the man suddenly licked her palm. She stared at him blankly. What are you doing? The man raised his brows. She did not move her hand away, and his actions were even more excessive. She quickly retracted her hands. Her face was already slightly red from the alcohol. and now it was even redder. She abruptly stood up and looked like she was about to leave. However, before she could take a step, Yuzheng knocked on the door. Feng Ling was stunned again. She suddenly turned back to look at Li Nanheng and said, "Is Mr. Mike here again?" Li Nanheng. It was obvious that Yuzheng was knocking on the door. He was probably preparing to come in and take away the dining car. Was her memory messed up after drinking too much? Or was it because the incident of hiding from Mr. Mike had left a deep impression on her? Then Feng Ling abruptly reached out to drag Li Nanheng, who was sitting on the sofa, and pushed him toward the bedroom. After entering the bedroom, she hurriedly pushed him onto the bed. Li Nanheng, hide in. She pushed him onto the bed, lifted the blanket, and covered him with it. Then she turned back to look at the bedroom door. As though she was avoiding an enemy, she carefully ran down and locked the door. Then she returned to the bed and looked at the man who had revealed his head from under the blanket. She was about to speak when she suddenly froze. "No, I should be the one hiding." Li Nanheng raised his brows and looked at the little cutie in front of him. He patted the spot beside him and made an inviting gesture. "Yes, do you want to come in and hide?" "All right," she answered very quickly. After all, his arm was injured, but she was not. She nimbly took off her shoes and went to bed. She lifted the blanket and covered herself with it. She lay down beside him and held her breath to prevent others from discovering her. The quilt covered both of them in darkness. The air was thin and very quiet. They were too close. In such a narrow space with little air, Feng Ling's heartbeat could almost be heard. It was very quiet. It's hot too. The whole world seemed to be isolated by this quilt. But it also seemed like this kind of belonging gave people a strange sense of security. She stayed under the blanket for a while, but she didn't hear anything. She thought about it and quickly lifted the blanket to take another look. However, just as she raised her hand to lift the blanket, the man beside her, whose breathing had gradually become heavy, suddenly turned over and pressed her down. The blanket was still not lifted. In this dark and narrow space, it was a little stuffy and hot, but the man's scorching kiss pressed down without hesitation. Feng Ling lay motionless and accepted the man's kiss. She just looked at him in the darkness. Li Nanheng did not lift the quilt, but kissed her deeply under the stuffy quilt. Again and again, he teased her lips and tongue, deep, entangled, and reluctant to part. When Feng Ling struggled to push him away from the quilt, because she couldn't breathe, he seemed to have sensed her intentions in an instant. He did not let go of her, but lifted the quilt to give her space to breathe, and then deepened his kiss between her lips. "You." Feng Ling could breathe normally. She pressed her hand against the man's chest, but her fingers gradually tightened. She did not push him away. The man's kiss gradually landed on her chin, gentle and affectionate. "I thought you were going to sleep with me." Feng Ling blinked in the darkness. The lights in the bedroom were not turned on. Only the moonlight from the window fell in, but she could still see their eyes and faces clearly. Seeing that she did not move, the man used his uninjured arm to prop himself up and looked at her with deep eyes. "I didn't want to kidnap you to the bed. You came up on your own. Tell me, if I let you go back at this time, how can I still be a King man?" Feng Ling looked at him for a long time and suddenly raised her hand to push him hard. The moment Li Nanheng thought he was going to push her away, she suddenly turned over and pushed him down on the bed with force. Then she pressed on him. The bed was very soft. Whether she lay down or he lay down, it was very comfortable. Li Nanheng stared at her, because she suddenly changed from passive to active. He did not do anything to her next. He just looked at her and slowly asked, word by word, "What do you want to do?" "Sleep with you," Feng Ling answered straightforwardly. She suddenly bent down and sucked on his lips. Li Nanheng lay motionless, allowing this woman who was still inexperienced in kissing to suck on his lips. Clearly, during the half a year in the jungle, he had patiently taught her how to kiss to make him feel better every night. But all her intelligence was used in the base. She could not learn these things well, and was always clumsy when kissing. Just like now in the business circle, she tried very hard to learn and adapt, but she was still not as good as when she learned those skills in the base. However, just this kiss that was so inexperienced that it almost hurt him, made the blood in the man's body boil. As Feng Ling kissed him hard, Li Nanheng felt that he should give her some encouragement. He raised his hand and placed it on the back of her head, pressing her head to prevent her from leaving. Just like this, their entanglement deepened. When Feng Ling's hand began to unbutton his shirt, the man gasped heavily because of her movements and gently bit her lips. "Little vixen, if you want to do it, move faster. Do you want to kill me?" Feng Ling unbuttoned his shirt as she kissed him. When the man's shirt was unbuttoned, she sighed against his lips as though she was relieved. Her hand stroked his well-defined and perfect chest, causing the man's muscles to tense as hard as stone. She imitated the way he usually kissed him and moved down bit by bit. She kissed his chin, then kissed his chin, and bit down bit by bit, kissed the man's protruding Adam's apple. Li Nanheng panted heavily and pressed his hand against her back, as though to prevent her from suddenly leaving. He held her tightly against him. Feng Ling could not get up, so she could only lie on his body and kiss him. When she suddenly sucked on the man's body, she suddenly heard the man's hoarse groan. Feng Ling blinked and could not help but kiss his lips again. Chapter 1341. After kissing for a while, Li Nanheng's shirt was forcefully pulled open by her. Her own clothes were slightly messy, and her long hair was entangled between their necks. Several times, many strands of hair stuck to his lips. The man seemed to be very patient as he kissed her hair inch by inch. Just as Feng Ling and the man kissed on the bed for a long time, Li Nanheng was ready to move. He couldn't wait for her to take off her clothes and reached out to pull down her pants. Feng Ling suddenly opened her misty eyes, pushed him away, and sat up straight on the bed. Caught off guard by her push, Li Nanheng really fell onto the bed. He raised his head abruptly and saw Feng Ling's expression, as though she had just woken up from a dream. His heart skipped a beat. She woke up so quickly? No. She sat there and suddenly said 2 words. Looking at her serious expression, Li Nanheng sat up, his shirt unbuttoned, and a large part of his chest was exposed to the air. He looked at the woman with a strange expression. "I'm still angry. I can't be like this with you." Fortunately, she didn't suddenly sober up. She just suddenly remembered that she couldn't go to bed so casually. Li Nanheng didn't know whether to cry or laugh. He lowered his head to look at the obvious changes in his pants that couldn't be concealed. "I've already been seduced by you like this, and you suddenly say you're still angry?" Feng Ling didn't look at him. As though she didn't hear him, she turned to get off the bed. Damn it, he was like this now, and she wanted to leave? How could Li Nanheng let her go so easily now? Out of habit, he raised his right hand to carry her back, but Feng Ling pushed him away as though she had been electrocuted. She used too much force and slapped the gauze on his arm. In an instant, Li Nanheng couldn't hold it in and groaned in pain. Suddenly hearing his painful groan, Feng Ling abruptly turned back to look at him. Seeing that he still cared about her, Li Nanheng held his arm and fell on the bed. As though he was in so much pain that he curled up on the bed and kept shouting, "Aya, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts." Hearing him yelling in pain, Feng Ling's expression of, "I can't let him touch me again," gradually turned slightly worried. She hurriedly looked around, found the bedside lamp, and turned on the wall lamp in front of the bed. With the help of the light, she saw that the gauze on his arm seemed to be bleeding again. Startled by the blood, she rushed over to pull his hand. However, before she could touch his hand, the man retracted his hand and continued to hug his arm as he lay on the bed in pain. The worry in Feng Ling's eyes became even more obvious. She must have forgotten that the gauze on his arm was bandaged by her. After being drunk, her memory was so messed up that she didn't know how his hand was injured. But right now, she did look very worried. Li Nanheng called out for a while. When he turned to see her expression, he couldn't bear to see her like this. He simply sat up, gathered his shirt that she had just torn apart, and slowly covered the bloody gauze with the cuffs of his shirt. He looked at her. "Are you still leaving?" Feng Ling looked at him gloomily, and then at his arm. She didn't dare to approach but was worried about his arm. "Why are you in a daze? I can't carry you now. Come over yourself." As he spoke, he pointed to the bed with his chin. "Sit down." Feng Ling glanced at him and sat down again. Li Nanheng calmed his emotions and glanced at the seat under his eyes. He sighed slightly and moved over to sit by her side. He lowered his eyes to look at her quiet appearance. You suddenly remembered that you're still angry, so you have to stay so far away from me? Aren't your principles a little too strong? Feng Ling still did not speak, but glanced at his arm from time to time. Why? Does your heart ache? He asked with a low chuckle. His voice was still a little husky, but because of his gentle tone, it also seemed to have a bewitching intent. It's good that you're not at the base. Otherwise, you'll always be injured. She sat there, looking at his arm as if she didn't hear what he said. She just muttered to herself. When you fight, you always use your arm to block. That's why, other than the occasional gunshot wounds on your body, your arm is the one that gets hurt the most. There were a few times when your arm was almost crippled. Hearing her suddenly say this, Li Nanheng did not speak and only looked at her. I still remember once when I was dressed in women's clothes in a bar. The gang that was about to be surrounded by us suddenly opened fire and almost injured me. You suddenly protected me. At that time, you were also grazed by a bullet here and bled a lot, she muttered. But at that time, I was still a boy, she continued. Speaking of this matter, Li Nanheng smiled and sighed. You still have the cheek to say that? I was turned gay by you, and then you forcibly turned straight by you. Oh, Feng Ling looked at him again, and then at the small tent under his pants. What is bent? What is straight? Li Nanheng. Seeing her curious eyes, Li Nanheng pulled the quilt over his pants to avoid being stared at by her, and lectured her seriously. You shouldn't have disguised yourself as a man to sneak into the base. If I had known that you were a little girl in the orphanage when you entered the base, perhaps I would have made an exception, and accepted you. After all, your skills and agility are not bad. Rules are dead but people are alive. I can change the rules, but you can't lie to others. Do you know that you've been disguised as a man in the base for so many years? Thousands of brothers have been deceived by you, and I have also been deceived by you for several years. Under your influence, everyone in the base lives like thousands of idiots. Are you very proud of yourself? Li Nanheng's tone sounded harsh and reproachful. Feng Ling looked at him, then at his arm, and then at her own hand. It seemed that she suddenly realized where she got the courage to pretend to be a man in a place with so many men. Seeing her eyes, Li Nanheng lectured her with a serious expression. Do you remember how much you cheated in the base? Did I punish you? In the end, he still protected you. Have you ever thought about how bad it was for you to lie one after another? Hearing this, Feng Ling sat up straighter by the bed and lowered her head. Clearly, she knew she was wrong and was humbly accepting his advice. This woman had always been the one with a serious, cold face and disdain for everything. It was only after she drank that she could be so cute and obedient, and let him bully her. Li Nanheng crossed his arms, and still looked at her with a serious expression. In fact, he was almost injured from holding back his laughter. Begging for monthly votes. Chapter 1342. Li Nanheng really liked Feng Ling when she was drunk. The moment she got drunk, all the difficulties that Li Nanheng and Li Nanheng had faced over the years were swept away. It was as though they had found a place to vent the energy that they had not released before. He looked seriously at Feng Ling, who was humbly accepting his teachings, and pointed to his heart. I'm a man. I'm holding my heart in front of you. So sincere and so passionate. How do you treat me? Don't you know what you're doing? Feng Ling nodded. Did she mean that she knew what she was doing? If she really knew what she was doing, would she treat him like this? Li Nanheng glanced at her. Did you understand what I said just now? Feng Ling nodded, paused, and then shook her head. Li Nanheng. He knew it. Li Nanheng suddenly grabbed her hand domineeringly and pressed it against his chest. She blushed as though she was scalded, and hurriedly pulled her hand away. He refused to let go and said in a low voice, I knew you were always like this. You can muddle through everything, but you can't do it with me. You stole my heart for 11 years and hurt it. You have to find a way to make it up to me. You can't just slip away. Anyway, you're mine, remember? Seeing Feng Ling nod again, Li Nanheng let go of her hand in satisfaction. Feng Ling looked at him and asked seriously, So is it your heart that's hurt? Of course. Otherwise, can it be my stomach? Oh. Feng Ling looked at him and pointed at his heart. She suddenly raised her hand and searched around her body. In the end, she took out a small woman's wallet, took out a bank card from it, and handed it to Li Nanheng. Then I'll pay you. Li Nanheng. Every time she got drunk, she would give bank cards everywhere. Who taught her this bad habit? Li Nanheng said. What I heard is my heart. Why are you compensating me? Feng Ling insisted and stuffed the bank card into his arms. But I have nothing except this. Li Nanheng's heart seemed to be pierced by an arrow. After a pause, he picked up the card. It was actually a gold card with a credit limit of more than 5 million yuan. As expected of CEO Feng, he's so generous. As he spoke, he directly accepted the card, then raised his eyebrows and looked at her. Since you're so generous, I can't go against my conscience and accept this money. But if you insist, I'll accept it. However, I can promise to do 2 things for you. Tell me, what do you want to do the most right now? Unexpectedly, as soon as he finished speaking, Feng Ling suddenly reached out and snatched the gold card from his hand. No. Li Nanheng watched as she carefully put the card back into her wallet. What's wrong? Feng Ling looked aggrieved and embarrassed. She shook her head silently and put her wallet back into her pocket listlessly. She looked a little disappointed. Li Nanheng raised his eyebrows. Didn't you want to give me the card just now? Why aren't you giving it to me now? You know that I'm sad. And now you're not even bothered to give me this little material compensation? You're going to go all out, aren't you? Feng Ling glanced at him. I don't have enough money right now. This money is for the company's meals and salaries. Li Nanheng did not speak for a long time. He just looked at her and said after a moment, So? Didn't you ask how to appease my anger? How about this? I won't give you the money. If you help me do 2 things, I'll appease my anger. What is it? The first thing is to help me beat up Feng Mingyi. Feng Ling looked at him carefully. Li Nanheng understood that she wanted him to help her get rid of that troublesome brat. After all, her path in the business circle was not very smooth. With her current strength, it was indeed not easy to deal with Tieming. However, she wanted to be strong. From the Feng Corporation's perspective, she could not show weakness. However, she did not have any external help. It was indeed difficult for her to rely on herself. You finally thought it through? I thought you were planning to fight with him, and then come to me with your face covered in dirt. You should have come to me directly when you felt that something was wrong. Even if it was just a simple sentence, I would have immediately stood up for you, loved you, and protected you. Why did you insist on acting tough until now? You couldn't sleep well for days and nights. And you only dared to show your weakness to me after drinking too much? The man looked at her, and his tone was indifferent. It was clear that he had finally heard what he wanted to hear. He was satisfied, but at the same time, he wanted to open her brain and see if her entire body was made of stone like her heart. As though not hearing his words, Feng Ling lowered her head and said, There's one more thing. Speak. Help me think of a way to raise 1 billion yuan. Li Nanheng raised his brows. Oh, didn't you want to bet with me? I can't beat you. I'll definitely lose. Feng Ling pinched her own fingers. Her tone sounded a little embarrassed. Oh, so if you lose, you'll marry me. Feng Ling suddenly raised her eyes to look at him. After looking at him for a while, Feng Ling's face became redder and redder. Finally, she couldn't hold on any longer. She lowered her head in defeat and pinched her fingers as she said, I promise I'll return that 1 billion yuan to you within 3 years. The important thing is when you'll marry me. It has nothing to do with that 1 billion yuan. You're my wife, and my net worth is all yours. I don't care if you want to return it for the rest of your life. The man stared at her little face. After you lose, will you really marry me? Feng Ling did not speak but glared at him. Let me get that 1 billion yuan first. Tisk, you're still talking about conditions when you're drunk. Li Nanheng said, All right, let's not talk about marrying or not. He could only climb up by relying on the stability of his lower body. He was already tired enough, but before he could catch his breath, he was pulled to the slide by the excited little woman, and then slid down in front of him. Li Nanheng. I just climbed up. This time, Feng Ling ignored him. She played on the swing alone for a while, then went to sit on the wooden horse by the side for a while, and then walked around the other children's entertainment facilities for a long time. In the end, she returned to the slide and climbed up. She looked down to see that Li Nanheng was still sitting on it without moving, leisurely sitting on it like a parent accompanying his child. She glanced at him. You really don't want to play? Play what? Over there, the seesaw. I can't play by myself. She felt wronged. Li Nanheng glanced over there, and then at her disappointed expression. He smiled and rubbed her head. All right, I'll play with you. Let me kiss you every time. Okay. She answered without hesitation. Li Nanheng smiled cunningly, pinched her chin, and kissed her hard on the lips. Then he looked at her dazed and moist eyes. This is my reward for accompanying you up here. Next, I'll kiss you every time. Remember it. Okay. She seemed to be calculating, and then felt that it should be quite worth it, so she agreed. Li Nanheng immediately slid down happily. The two of them played with the seesaw, the little balance bike, the house, the sand, and all kinds of things that two adults could play at the same time in the children's entertainment area. In the end, Feng Ling was so happy that when she slid down the slide again, she sat in Li Nanheng's arms. The two of them slid down at the same time. When they landed, Li Nanheng was afraid that she would fall, so he hugged her tightly. She screamed excitedly in his arms and kept waving her hands. There was also the rocking car. Li Nanheng's figure definitely couldn't sit in such a small car. Feng Ling relied on her thin body and could actually sit in it. She threw in 2 hard coins and could ride for a while. She repeatedly begged Li Nanheng to help her change coins on the machine by the side. In the end, when the two of them came out of the children's entertainment area, their faces were covered in dust. Feng Ling ignored the sweat on her body and the dust on the entertainment facilities and pointed to the vending machine that could make ice cream with robots. I want to eat ice cream. All right. Li Nanheng agreed readily. He walked over and put the money in to buy one. He chose blueberry. After the ice cream was done, Feng Ling happily took it. She took 2 bites with a small spoon and frowned. She stuffed the ice cream cup into his hand. It's not delicious. Usually, this kind of machine-made ice cream did not taste as good as handmade ice cream. After all, it was repeatedly frozen and melted by the machine. However, for someone like Li Nanheng who didn't like sweets, the taste was no different. He took a bite with the spoon she had just used. It's not bad. It doesn't taste that bad. I won't eat it. You eat it, Feng Ling said. Li Nanheng didn't force her. After helping her eat a few bites, he dug out the blueberry jam inside and brought it to her mouth. Feng Ling glanced at it and ate the blueberry jam. In the end, when the ice cream cup was thrown away, she naughtily grabbed the cup, squeezed it into a cone, and threw it in the direction of the trash can. However, due to the wind and the fact that the cup was made of paper, it was blown to the side and landed on the grass. Li Nanheng sighed with a smile. He picked up the cup and threw it into the trash can. He turned back and said, "Don't throw things around." Chapter 1344. However, as soon as he said that, he saw a disappointed expression on her face. The paper cup definitely felt different from when she was on the shooting field and playing darts. It looked like it had lost its aim, and it really didn't make her happy. I'll bring you back to the base when I have time. You can play with darts, guns, and sniper rifles. Forget about this kind of paper cup. The man touched her head and coaxed her softly. Feng Ling glanced at him. All right. From the sound of it, she was still not very happy. Clearly, she remembered that she was no longer familiar with the base, and there was a hint of complaint in her eyes. Li Nanheng couldn't help but hug her and touch the back of her head. All right, life can't be the same. Sooner or later, you have to leave. Just vent your anger on me. Don't be stifled by yourself. I want to go swimming. She didn't respond to his words. Instead, she suddenly said this in a muffled voice in his arms. Li Nanheng lowered his head to look at her. Didn't you already go in the afternoon? I didn't go into the water in the afternoon. I've been sitting by the side busy with work. Now I want to go swimming. Since she wanted to, he would accompany her. Li Nanheng brought her to the pool. In the end, Feng Ling probably felt that the night was a little cold, so she walked around the pool and went to the hot springs in front. It was not that the two of them had never soaked in a hot spring together before, but this was the first time she took the initiative to drag him to the hot spring in a daze after drinking too much. When the two of them walked over, she knew to go to the female guest changing area to change her clothes. When she changed into a swimsuit, she wrapped herself in a bath towel and entered the hot spring before putting the bath towel aside. Li Nanheng had long been waiting in the pool, but he saw that she did not come to the pool he was soaking in. Instead, she went to the one next to him, which happened to be 2 meters away from him. Feng Ling sat inside and lowered her head to play with the red rose petals floating on her side of the hot spring. She then observed the distance between her and Li Nanheng and seemed to be very satisfied with this distance. She nodded and seriously sat in the hot spring and closed her eyes. Li Nanheng was about to go over. Even though Feng Ling had her eyes closed, when she heard the sound of water, she suddenly said, "Don't come over, Li Nanheng." He was a patient with an injured arm, and he had to be careful not to touch the water while soaking in the hot spring. He had worked so hard to accompany her out for so long, but they were not allowed to soak in the same hot spring pool. What was going on? Seeing that Feng Ling was about to fall asleep, Li Nanheng said to himself, "The taboo of soaking in a hot spring is sleeping. Do you want to die?" After saying that, he felt that he would definitely have a good reason to go there now. So he got up and went to the hot spring. When he entered the water, Feng Ling almost fell asleep. She abruptly woke up and opened her eyes to see that the man had approached. She had almost fallen asleep earlier, and now her eyes were slightly dazed as she stared at him. The man approached and pulled her into his arms. He sat her on his lap and let her soak in the hot spring in his arms. "Don't sleep. It's easy for something to happen if you sleep in the hot spring. It's not good for your health." Feng Ling glanced at him and rested her head on his shoulder. Li Nanheng's entire body stiffened because of her sudden obedience. He lowered his eyes to look at the little woman, who was obediently sitting in his arms. She was wearing a new white swimsuit specially provided for the female guests. It was not considered revealing, but it was not particularly conservative either. It was a very standard style, but when she wore it, it made her originally fair skin even fairer. Her cheeks were pink from the faint alcohol, and from soaking in the hot spring for a long time. He deliberately got her drunk, and spent so much time and effort. His original goal was to listen to what she had been saying all these years. Now that he had achieved his goal, he had kissed her and hugged her. He didn't have to take her. As long as he was sure that she didn't have any other reason other than being angry, he could solve all the problems and patiently wait for the day she took the initiative and was willing to do it. However, at this moment, Li Nanheng found that no matter what reason he found, he could not deceive himself. He wanted her. He wanted her all the time. He didn't want to just hug her here. He didn't want to just watch her sleep. He wanted to sleep with her. Feng Ling was originally sitting in his arms. Suddenly, she opened her eyes as though she was uncomfortable and looked at him in a daze. Only then did Li Nanheng realize that as he hugged her, his hand was tightly gripping her waist. He did not change his position for a long time. He probably pinched her waist bone. She glanced at him unhappily. He quickly retracted his hand and simply hugged her. "Did I hurt you?" Her waist hurt from his grip, but Feng Ling did not say anything. She just shook her head and continued to sit in his arms, looking quiet and obedient. Li Nanheng's heart skipped a beat. He raised his hand and hooked his finger to touch her chin. But after touching it twice, Feng Ling suddenly turned her head and looked at him again. Her eyes were a little cold. "Don't touch me." Her fair face still had a tinge of redness, and her long and curled eyelashes had transparent water droplets on them. Her expression looked much colder than when she was in the children's entertainment area. But her eyes were still hazy. She told him not to touch her. Now that she was in his arms, who could stand it? Besides, he had been playing with her outside for so long in the middle of the night. Couldn't she let him have a taste of this little cookie? It was likely that the alcohol content of the 2 bottles of wine tonight was really not low, and the after effect was not light either. Li Nanheng's head was a little hot from being soaked in the hot spring. In addition, Feng Ling's cold expression seemed to be when she was awake. Her gaze in this scene made the desire in the depths of his heart churn, overwhelming all his concerns and concessions. He kissed the sensitive spot under her ear and chuckled hoarsely. "You dragged me out and dragged me to the hot spring. You're dressed like this, and sitting in my arms like this. You still won't let me touch you? Your methods of torturing people are getting better and better, and? Feng Ling glared at him, and there seemed to be some chagrin and awkwardness in her eyes. Before she could move away from his arms, the man could no longer hold it in. As though he had gone mad, he pressed the back of her head and kissed her harshly. Li Nanhing's kiss was too fierce and heavy. One of Feng Ling's hands was still in the water. She subconsciously tried to hold on to something, but the man firmly held her waist. The only thing she could hold on to was his leg. However, as soon as she reached down, she was scalded and abruptly retracted her hand. The man grunted and almost rubbed her into his bones. Begging for monthly votes, ha ha. Chapter 1345. Feng Ling seemed to be angered by Li Nanhing's fierce kiss. She suddenly raised her hand and pulled hard on his neck. Li Nanhing only felt a strong force that belonged to her when she was at the peak of the base, and he was involuntarily dragged into the water by Feng Ling. Except for an injured arm that was still supporting on the edge of the pool, his entire body, including his head, was also in the water. The water splashed everywhere and was out of control. He didn't know if he started first or if she suddenly started first, but when Li Nanhing popped his head out of the water, Feng Ling also came out of the water with him. Her two slender arms tightly wrapped around his neck, holding him, and her lips and teeth were entangled with his for a long time. The two of them were tightly pressed together. Both of them were clearly wet, but Li Nanhing's mind was full of dry firewood and raging fire. He only maintained his sobriety for a few seconds. There was a faint voice in his heart telling him that if he really took advantage of Feng Ling being drunk and unable to distinguish right from wrong, she would definitely be angry afterward. However, as Feng Ling suddenly took the initiative, this voice gradually disappeared in his mind. Li Nanhing ignored his injured arm and directly hugged her tightly in the water. Even though the gauze was soaked in water, he didn't feel any pain and kissed her inseparably. He had long forgotten his inner promise and thoughts of she drank too much and I was just coaxing her. I was just playing with her. And, if she was unwilling tonight, there was no need to take the last step. Suddenly, Li Nanhing snorted, parted his lips and cursed in a low voice. You're so drunk and yet you still bite me? Weren't you quite gentle when you were lying on me in the room just now? Why did you bite so hard? Hearing Li Nanhing's words, Feng Ling didn't say a word but bit his chin again. Li Nanhing instantly shivered in pain, but he also shivered in pleasure. He frowned slightly and held her tightly in his arms. As if taking revenge, he reached into the water and rubbed her sensitive parts hard. Because of a movement of his hand underwater, Feng Ling's expression suddenly changed. Li Nanhing chuckled, took a few breaths and kissed her red and wet lips. How is it? How do you feel? He tugged the necklace from the back of her neck and dragged her into the water, the moment her swimsuit slid down to prevent her from getting cold. His tone was filled with the excitement of knowing that no matter what he did to her, she wouldn't get angry. You've taken the initiative twice tonight. When you suddenly stopped in the room just now, I almost choked half to death. If you dare to back away now, even if I have to force myself on you, I'll make sure you stay here. You won't be able to escape, do you understand? The man held her waist firmly with one hand and the edge of the pool with the other. Their bodies were so hot that it was as if they were about to catch fire. The edge of the pool was already a mess because of the water splashing everywhere. Feng Ling still didn't speak. When she reached the edge, she almost used all her strength to grab the man in front of her. Li Nanhing paused. Before he could understand what she was going to do, he was suddenly pressed against the edge of the pool by Feng Ling. Half of his body was still in the water, but Feng Ling was very fierce. She was completely different from her usual cold and indifferent self when she was sober, nor was she as cute and adorable as she was when she was drunk. Li Nanhing's back hurt from the impact, but it only turned into a sexy grunt. He lowered his eyes to look at the woman in his arms, who was suddenly as fierce as a little leopard. He lowered his head and said hoarsely by her ear, "What? You're coming tonight? You don't allow me to take the initiative? Do you want to move by yourself?" The earlobe by his lips was as white as jade. When Li Nanhing finished speaking, he couldn't help but bite her ear. After biting it, he gently sucked and kissed it. Feng Ling's fingers that were holding his shoulder instantly tightened. Her slightly long nails seemed to be about to dig into the skin of his shoulder. At the same time, she put down her hand and reached for the black swimming trunks he was wearing when he soaked in the hot spring. Li Nanheng curved his lips and lowered his head to steal another kiss on her cheek. He panted and said, "So impatient?" With that, he reached into the water and pressed her hand against his waist. "There's no need for you to take it off. I'll do it myself." After speaking, he directly took it off himself. The swimsuit on Feng Ling's body had long fallen off. Right now the two of them were naked. Their bodies were pressed against each other, and their skin was rubbing against each other. They hugged and kissed each other intimately. Li Nanheng's left hand pressed against the back of Feng Ling's neck, not allowing her to separate, not even the slightest gap. However, Feng Ling's kiss was inexplicably close to biting. She placed her hand on his back and touched the old wounds on his back. Her movements gradually became gentle as she gently caressed them. However, Li Nanheng's hand was very impolite. As he kissed, he had already wandered around her body several times. In the end, he greedily stopped at her waist and slowly moved down, rubbing back and forth. Although it was late at night, there would be people passing by at any time. It was also possible that someone couldn't sleep and would come to soak in the hot spring or swim. However, Li Nanheng knew that if he stopped at this time, the cold wind would give Feng Ling a chance to wake up. He would probably suffocate to death here. His movements became more and more unbridled, and the kiss gradually changed from her lips to her chin, and then down bit by bit, passing through her slender neck, beautiful collarbone, and then down. Their ears were filled with each other's uncontrollable breathing. Li Nanheng had already endured to the point where the veins on his forehead were throbbing, but he couldn't. Although he would really explode from suffocation if he didn't do it, the hot spring water was not sanitary. So he simply grabbed her hand underwater and helped him solve it. The moment she obediently allowed him to pull her over, Li Nanheng felt all the blood in his body rush to a certain place. As his scalp went numb, the man's throat overflowed with a faint voice. "Gently, gently. Feng Ling, why are you so heavy-handed today?" At a certain moment Li Nanheng's mind went blank. After a long while, he hugged the woman in his arms tightly again, bent down to kiss her fiercely, and then turned back to wrap the two of them in a bath towel. He quickly walked back along the road that led directly to the dormitory area from the pool. Feng Ling allowed him to wrap her in the bath towel and let him carry her away without struggling. When she tilted her head, his kiss fell again. He couldn't separate, couldn't pause, and couldn't let her escape again. The passionate kiss continued until they returned to the room. Li Nanheng kicked the door open and carried her in. After entering the door, he carried her into the bathroom of the suite without hesitation and returned to the bed that had been tossed into a mess. He threw her onto the bed and pressed her down mercilessly. Chapter 1346. This was such an exciting night. How they gave each other, satisfied each other, and demanded from each other until they were exhausted. By the second half of the night, even Li Nanheng could barely remember. Tonight, the little woman was as enchanting as fire on his body. She took the initiative to make him wonder if she was only like this when she was drunk. However, he couldn't spare the effort to think about it. He was pestered by her again and again until he wished he could die on her. The night passed quickly. The wound on Li Nanheng's arm was slightly infected and inflamed in the hot spring pool. He didn't take care of this arm all night. In the early morning, his body temperature was slightly high. Feng Ling was woken up by the rising temperature of the man's body. She abruptly opened her eyes and felt that the man's injured and inflamed arm was still holding her firmly. She slowly sat up, slowly pushed his hand away, turned her eyes, and looked at him calmly for a while before looking at the condition of his arm. Last night, when the two of them were rolling on the bed, he felt that the wet gauze was a hindrance, so he took it off and threw it away. Although the bleeding had stopped, the wound was obviously white and swollen. She felt that it was probably a fever caused by the heat from the wound. She had already sat up, but he still hadn't woken up. It was obvious that his fever wasn't light. She gently got off the bed, turned around, and brought in the gauze and disinfectant that she hadn't used last night. She then returned to the bed and gently treated his wound. She disinfected the infected area for a while longer. Li Nanhing frowned in his sleep because of the stinging pain on his arm. Several times when he was about to wake up, Feng Ling pressed her hand to his eyes, stroked his eyebrows and said softly, "Continue sleeping." If he woke up, she wouldn't be able to continue sitting here calmly and helping him apply medicine. As expected, the man continued to fall asleep because of her temperature and voice. She slowly retracted her hand and continued to apply medicine. After repeating this for almost half an hour, she finally treated his wound and slowly wrapped it with gauze. When everything was done, the sky outside was already bright. It was probably past 6 in the morning. Feng Ling got up and found a bathrobe in the closet in the room. To put it on. After all, in this kind of resort, people often wore bathrobes to eat breakfast in the morning, so this kind of appearance wouldn't arouse anyone's suspicion. When she went out, she happened to meet Yu Zheng, who had just come up from the room downstairs. Others didn't know what was going on, but Yu Zheng knew which clothes Feng Ling had worn yesterday. She had stayed in CEO Li's room for an entire night and had only left now. She had changed into a bathrobe. Feng Ling did not say much. She only nodded politely at Yu Zheng and walked out. When she passed by him, she said, "The wound on your CEO Li's arm is infected and inflamed. I've treated his wound, but I'm definitely not as professional as a professional. He has a fever. Keep an eye on his condition. If he doesn't feel, let him take some medicine." Yu Zheng was stunned. "Miss Feng." Feng Ling did not speak anymore and walked out, leaving Yu Zheng standing there in a daze. Hadn't she already treated his wound last night? Why did it suddenly become infected and inflamed to the point of having a fever? When Feng Ling returned to her room, Qin Shuk had just woken up. She sat lazily on the sofa and glanced at Feng Ling's outfit. She snorted, "I knew you didn't come back last night. Something good must have happened." Sure enough, Li Nanhing is more skilled. As long as he meets you, he can definitely settle you. He could settle her? With wine? Feng Ling was too lazy to explain. She took a shower and changed her clothes. Qin Shuk was still lying on the sofa. She said lazily, "I soaked in the hot spring yesterday and felt weak all over. After sleeping, I still feel sleepy. Help me bring breakfast back to eat. I don't want to go out to eat." "I don't want to eat either. Call someone to bring it over." Feng Ling sat on the sofa and brought the computer over. She placed it on her lap and turned on the computer to work. Qin Shuk simply jumped forward and rested her head on her lap. At the same time, she picked up a pillow next to her and hugged it in her arms. She rested it on her lap with a very comfortable expression and said, "I say, are you really not going to tell me what happened last night? I didn't see you when I came back. You didn't come back for the whole night. If I didn't know you had some martial arts, I'm afraid ordinary people wouldn't have the ability to kidnap you. I'm afraid I would have called the police to come to the resort to find you." Feng Ling stared at the computer screen. "We probably won't be able to attend the financing conference in Washington. After all, the Feng Corporation's current situation is strained. This is something that many partners can see. Especially a few days ago, the stock price fell due to certain circumstances. Now it has risen and fallen. We should return to New York as soon as possible to stabilize the situation. As for this side, I was originally determined to get that financing, but based on the current situation, I can only let go. Otherwise, the company will be hurt, and we won't get any benefits." Hearing that she had changed the topic, Qin Shuk wanted to say something, but what Feng Ling said was indeed an important choice. She sat up with the pillow in her arms, crossed her legs, and leaned against the sofa. She turned to look at Feng Ling. "But this 1 billion yuan is too important to the Feng Corporation. We've been out for so many days. If we don't bring back a single cent, the old people in the company who don't know the truth will only say that you're incompetent. They don't know what's going on, but you know their mouths." "I know." Feng Ling placed her hand on the keyboard and said indifferently as she typed, "It's not that I can't get a single cent back, but 1 billion yuan is very difficult. I have to think of another way. As for TMing, I plan to solve it before returning to New York. We can talk about other things later. What do you want to do about TMing? I have my ways, but it might be a little risky. Feng Ling's tone was still indifferent. Qin Shuk looked at her for a while, and suddenly reached out to tug at Feng Ling's collar. When she saw the ambiguous kiss marks on her neck and collarbone, she immediately sucked in a breath of cold air. Oh my God, he's too heavy-handed. Yesterday, your body was fine, but now your neck and shoulders, oh my God. Feng Ling's face instantly turned red. She quickly pushed her away and adjusted her clothes. She turned to glare at her. Why did you lift my clothes? Chapter 1347. I'm just curious about your battle last night. Qin Shuk held back her laughter and blushed. After all, although she was very bold, she had never met a man who could make her willingly sleep with him. She had always only dared to watch and speak. She had never dared to do anything. I didn't expect it. She smiled. It seems like Li Nanheng really had a good time last night. Have you been enlightened? Have you remembered who the boss is? I knew it. You shouldn't keep holding back your bad temper. When it's time to show weakness to him, you should show weakness. This way perhaps CEO Li can. Feng Ling closed the computer and turned to leave, no longer listening to her nonsense. She had drunk too much last night. Later in the hot spring, perhaps because the water was too hot, the alcohol concentration in her body had dropped significantly, causing her to be half awake. But perhaps it was because of the environment, the scene, the lingering alcohol in her body, the tenderness in the man's eyes. Because of various reasons, even though she was clearly sober, she couldn't help herself. She didn't want to think about it anymore. There were only 2 days in the resort. The first day passed just like that. The next morning, Li Nanheng's fever had not subsided. He was resting in his room, and she didn't see him for the entire morning. After the afternoon, Feng Ling sat in the dessert house in the resort, eating dessert with Qin Shuk while talking about work with a certain boss. Of course, the other party wouldn't give her any financing. They were only talking about some simple cooperation cases. Thankfully, the conversation was very pleasant. Although the company behind this husband wasn't very strong and couldn't help much in terms of financing, he could at least add tens of millions of yuan to the phone corporation. This could be considered as temporarily solving the company's urgent problem. The current situation in the company was not as good as it seemed. The only liquid funds could only maintain the salary of all the employees for a month, and the money to maintain some things on the surface. There was really not a single cent left. These tens of millions were like rain after a long drought. It was really not easy. They chatted happily. After the boss left, Feng Ling finally revealed a sincere smile. Qin Shuk ate a small cake with her and worked together. The afternoon passed quickly. At night, most of the people in the resort had to catch an early flight tomorrow to go abroad for business, so they wouldn't stay here tonight. Feng Ling was the same. Before leaving, when she went to the parking lot, she finally saw Li Nanheng. His fever should have gone down. He was dressed in a suit and looked very energetic. He was very different from the man with an arm injury last night. Feng Ling just looked at him silently in the parking lot, and then entered her car as if nothing had happened. Qin Shuk thought she would say something to Li Nanheng, but unexpectedly, there was nothing, so she also entered the car. Seeing Feng Ling's expression, she didn't look shy or angry, and she didn't know what she was thinking. Yu Zheng, on the other hand, stood by the side and looked at the car door that had already been closed. He then looked at the man in front of him. CEO Li, Miss Feng, and we should be going the same way. Should we call them over for a ride? No need. Although Li Nanheng did not say much, his gaze toward Feng Ling's car deepened. After leaving the resort, nothing happened for 3 or 4 days. Feng Ling and Li Nanheng seemed to have a tacit understanding that they didn't even send each other a call or a text message. It was as though what happened that night was really just an erotic dream she couldn't remember after getting drunk. However, whether she was awake or drunk at that time, she knew, and he knew. In the last few days in Washington, Feng Ling was busy talking about cooperation every day. After running into a wall several times, she managed to negotiate 2 deals and a financing case. But the total revenue from all the deals and financing was only 300 million yuan. It wasn't enough to fill the gaps between her teeth. It could only be said that it could alleviate a small part of the urgent need. As for Tieming, she had already made preparations. Back then, she had also gambled with Feng Mingyi, but this so-called gamble covered many aspects, not just the 1 billion yuan of financing. Just as Feng Ling was about to go to Tieming again and meet Feng Mingyi, a piece of news suddenly exploded in the financial world of Washington. The head of Tieming, Feng Mingyi, was arrested by the Washington police for a murder 3 years ago. Tieming was also suspected of a major financial case of money laundering 2 years ago. Looking at the news, Feng Ling sat in front of the computer and did not move for a long time. Qin Shuk also stood by the side and looked at the news on the screen. Then she lowered her head and turned on her phone to look at it for a while. She was sure that the news was true, and this news had quickly covered the entire Chinese business circle in the United States. Almost in an instant, it was in everyone's sight. "This is God helping you?" Qin Shuk said in shock. Feng Mingyi doesn't look like a good person, but he was actually involved in a murder case, and was even involved in a money laundering case. Now that this kind of thing is exposed, I'm afraid he's completely finished, right? Who is this? At such a critical moment, he suddenly knocked him down. There's no need for you to do anything. At this moment, Feng Ling couldn't help but wonder if she had said something after she drank too much at Li Nanheng's place that day. These were all evidence and information that she had already collected, but she hadn't found a chance to expose it. Furthermore, it wasn't as complete as the other parties. If she wanted to obtain so much evidence, it would probably take at least a few months. However, it was clear that someone had really helped her get rid of Feng Mingyi. She had never remembered clearly what happened after she was drunk, but she couldn't have said anything. Could it be? Qin Shuk suddenly shifted her gaze to Feng Ling Li. Go check on Tieming's current stock and internal situation. After all, there's something wrong with the person in charge of Tieming. The internal liquidity has probably been stopped. See if they have any other way out. If not, it means that the Feng Corporation will take back Tieming. Feng Ling didn't say much about this. She just struck while the iron was hot. Feng Mingyi doesn't need us to care about him now, but we can't give up Tieming. This is an industry that my father released back then. We have to take it back now. Qin Shuk glanced at her. All right, I'll go check. Then she suddenly paused. By the way, if they still have clean funds, this sum of funds might be able to fill our current peacock. Killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Wonderful. Chapter 1348. Qin Shuk was right. Even if Tieming was involved in money laundering, it must have been because of 2 years ago. Putting aside what he did back then, Tieming had been showing off in the financial world for the past 2 years. There should be a lot of clean money in his liquid funds. Even if he didn't have 1 billion yuan, he should still have 300 to 400 million yuan. After Qin Shuk left, Feng Ling looked at the information on the computer for a while. She stood up and walked to the huge window behind her. She looked at the tallest financial building on the street in Washington, and at the silver top. Since Feng Mingyi had done such a shady business, he must have been very careful in his actions. Furthermore, his relationships with various parties were very strong. If the person behind him did not have a certain amount of power, it would definitely not have been so clean and neat to expose his affairs. Feng Mingyi did not even have a chance to catch his breath, and walked onto the path of death. In fact, she hadn't even participated in any disputes. She didn't even have the chance to participate in a fight. This matter had indeed solved her urgent problem, but the only person she could think of who could do this was Li Nanheng. The current situation of the Feng Corporation was not as optimistic as it seemed on the surface. However, in order to control the overall situation, she couldn't show everyone her current tense side. She had been enduring and thinking of ways to support the Feng Corporation, but many people in the circle had sharp eyes. Even if they didn't say it, they understood the situation of the Feng Corporation, so they definitely wouldn't easily help. After all, there were no benefits for them. Indeed, other than Li Nanheng, who could help her without asking for the result, there was no one else who could be so willing to help her. However, She had never mentioned the phone corporation's situation, but Li Nanhing knew what her first step was. Before she made a move, he helped her cut off the other party's path of attack. Feng Ling stood by the window and watched for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Li Nanheng. No one picked up the phone for a long time. She called again but no one picked up. She found his current assistant, Yu Zheng's number in the address book. This time it went through. Hello, Miss Feng. Assistant Yu, is CEO Li here? CEO Li is not in Washington right now. Miss Feng, you can call his private number. I just called but he didn't pick up. I'm not too sure about that. CEO Li has been quite busy since returning from the vacation. He occasionally deals with the company's matters, and occasionally discusses something with Brother Su. However, when he and Brother Su are discussing things, I'm basically not around. Yu Zheng said respectfully. CEO Li didn't say anything before he left this time. He only said that he had something to do and returned to Los Angeles. Fortunately, our vice president was transferred over. As long as the person in charge appears, we can participate in the financial conference normally. Xiao Su had been by Li Nanheng's side, which Feng Ling knew very well. It was true that apart from the company and work, Yu Zheng had no access to Li Nanheng's past life and the people around him, nor would he know anything other than his working hours. Feng Ling thanked him and hung up the phone. Right now, she was 90% sure that Li Nanheng was the one behind Tieming, but he suddenly returned to Los Angeles in a hurry. She didn't know what happened, but after all, 11 Base and the Li Corporation were both in Los Angeles, so she couldn't make wild guesses. She did not call Li Nanheng again. She stood in front of the window and watched silently for a while before picking up her phone again to call Feng Mingyi. Feng Mingyi had been arrested, but he was still a suspect and had not been officially sentenced. Under the surveillance of the police, he could still answer calls normally. The next day, Feng Ling went to Tieming. When the staff of Tieming saw that it was the current CEO of the phone corporation, none of them dared to speak loudly, but they still whispered in a corner that they thought no one else could see. After all, many of the old employees who came out with Tieming knew the relationship between Tieming and the phone corporation. Now that something had happened to Feng Mingyi and Tieming had been put on hold because of money laundering, if the phone corporation did not take over, all the employees in the company would face the disaster of losing a month's salary and losing their jobs. If the phone corporation took over, the old employees who had followed Feng Mingyi out would definitely not have a good time. All the employees of Tieming had their own plans, but they didn't know how this young female CEO of the phone corporation wanted to treat them. However, to their surprise, Feng Ling only brought people over to check all the company's accounts and all the recent large expenditure channels and large income channels. After sorting out the liquid funds that the company could still use freely, she only held an afternoon meeting with several executives in the finance department and did not say anything to the HR department. After the meeting with the finance department, Feng Ling actually left. She still didn't go to the HR department to talk about the layoffs or the changes in Tieming's personnel. However, everyone was still on tenterhooks. They didn't know if they would face unemployment, and with the current situation, it was very likely that the entire company wouldn't receive a salary. All the employees of Tieming were depressed for 2 days. It wasn't until the phone corporation issued an official recall letter to Tieming that the proper arrangements for all the employees of Tieming were sent to the company that all the employees heaved a sigh of relief. She actually had no intention of firing them. Although Feng Ling planned to take Tieming back to the phone corporation, she planned to only be a subsidiary company of the phone corporation. She wouldn't completely bring it back to the headquarters. At the same time, she would let these old employees in Tieming enjoy all the normal treatment they had in the past. She wouldn't let any of them leave, but she had to let every employee pass the ability test and quality test again. If they all passed, none of them would be laid off. If there were people who didn't pass the test and were in the company would make other arrangements for them. Very fair. Furthermore, Feng Mingyi's downfall did not affect the lives and work of the employees in Tieming. This allowed Feng Ling to establish a more amiable image in the entire company. It proved that she was not a tyrannical and harsh manager, and was very popular. Ever since Feng Mingyi's accident, the work of reorganizing Tianming finally stabilized after 2 or 3 days. Feng Ling finally found the time to call Li Nanheng. However, this time, no one picked up for a long time. The other party had no signal, and was not in the service area. Chapter 1349. At night, Feng Ling had been busy all day, and had just fallen asleep when her phone suddenly vibrated by her pillow. She abruptly opened her eyes, picked up her phone and sat up. "Miss Feng, I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but little Momo suddenly has a high fever. CEO Li isn't here right now. We have to send Momo to the hospital, but it's not easy for us to make the decision. We can only inform you first." It was a call from her assistant Yu Zheng. When Feng Ling heard that little Momo was sick, she immediately woke up. Why did he suddenly have a high fever? I'm not sure yet. CEO Li hired 2 very reliable aunties to take care of him here. But yesterday, Auntie brought little Momo to the nearby children's amusement park to play. I don't know if it's because there are too many children there, or if there's any flu virus. Although he washed his hands after coming back, I heard that it's the peak period for children to catch a cold. Little Momo's fever hasn't subsided since 4 in the afternoon. I understand. Send him to the hospital first. I'll be there soon. All right. I'll send you the hospital's location later. After hanging up the phone, Feng Ling quickly got up to change her clothes. Because she had just fallen asleep, and suddenly woke up, her head hurt a little. She washed her face with cold water and went out. She drove all the way to the hotel where little Momo was staying. Along the way, she received the hospital's location from Yu Zheng. It was near the hotel. She stepped on the accelerator and sped up. When they arrived at the hospital, little Momo had already been injected with a muscle injection to reduce his fever. Because the injection was too painful, he was crying in Yu Zheng's arms. Feng Ling went over and called out, "Momo." Hearing her voice, little Momo turned back aggrievedly and stretched out his arms for her to carry. There were still tears on the little guy's face. His face was red from the fever. Feng Ling hurriedly took him and held him in her arms. As she coaxed and patted his back, she looked around. There were many parents holding their children, and most of them seemed to have a high fever. "How is it? Did you find out the reason?" Feng Ling asked as she patted little Momo, who was sobbing in her arms. Yu Zheng nodded. "It's nothing. It's just a cold. The source of infection is probably in the amusement park. There are too many children there, and many of them are coughing." Auntie saw that little Momo was too bored and wanted to go out to play with him, but she didn't expect him to catch a cold. Fortunately, the doctor said that under normal circumstances, after the fever subsides tomorrow morning, it'll be fine. I'm really sorry for troubling you so late. What's there to be embarrassed about? I entrusted little Momo to you to take care of. He's sick now, so I should come no matter how late it is. As Feng Ling spoke, she kissed little Momo's little face with heartache. Feeling that his face was indeed hot, she couldn't help but ask, "Won't it be a problem if it keeps burning?" Momo 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 Mother Momo Momo ill and Mother up 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 up. Feng Ling had never taken care of a child before, and this was the first time she had encountered such a sick child. Thankfully, Yu Zheng's words were clear and simple, which put her at ease. "Momo, be good. Auntie will accompany you in the hospital tonight, okay?" Feng Ling kissed the little guy's face again. Little Momo did not speak. He hugged her neck and cried aggrievedly. From time to time, he would reach out to touch his own butt. It seemed like the injection was really painful. Feng Ling touched his little butt, lowered her head, and whispered in his ear, "Does it hurt?" Little Momo choked up again. He sniffled in her arms and said, Momo, it hurts. Little pitiful." Feng Ling touched him again, her heart aching. She turned back and asked a few more questions. After confirming that she could carry little Momo to a resting room near the emergency room, or a quiet ward for the child to rest, she carried Momo upstairs to find a ward. Originally, she wanted to put little Momo on the bed, but he refused to let go. He even hugged her neck tightly and sobbed. Feng Ling couldn't bear to see him like this. She simply hugged him and coaxed him. At the same time, She instructed Yu Zheng to buy food for little Momo. He had just been injected with a fever, so there were many things that he couldn't eat randomly. Yu Zheng went out for a long time before he bought something edible. He also bought a lot of toys that little boys liked, such as cars, planes, and so on. Little Momo's eyes lit up when he saw the toys, but he couldn't bear to leave Feng Ling's embrace. He struggled for a long time until Feng Ling said, "Momo, sit here and play with the toys. Auntie won't leave. Auntie won't be so busy recently. I can have a lot of time to accompany you, okay?" The little guy finally let go and turned to focus on playing with the toys. Seeing that he was so sensible, he only cried when the injection hurt. After that, it no longer hurt, and he didn't cry because he was sick. Other than asking adults to hug him, he only played with his toys. He was really a very obedient little baby. Feng Ling supported her chin with one hand and sat on the chair by the bed. She leaned against the table by the bed and looked at little Momo, who looked up at her blankly for help because he couldn't understand the new toy. It was a transformer toy. It seemed like its limbs could be removed to turn into a small car. But after removing it, it was a little difficult to restore it. Feng Ling had never played with it before and didn't know much about it. However, looking at the little guy's pleading expression, she couldn't help but reach over to play with him. In the end, after spending more than an hour, she still couldn't recover an arm or leg. In the end, even the appearance of the car changed. Yu Zheng went out to bring back little Momo's blood test results. As soon as he entered the door, he saw Feng Ling, who was usually cold and aloof, leaning against the bed and playing with the transformer with little Momo. Most importantly, both of them looked helpless. Yu Zheng smiled and walked over to put down the blood test results. He went forward to help. As expected, it was easy for men to play with such toys. In a few moments he was done. Little Momo jumped around on the bed excitedly and kept shouting that Uncle Yu was awesome. Feng Ling was infected by this atmosphere and suddenly felt that children were so cute and naive. No matter how uncomfortable they were, no matter how painful the injection was, as long as a toy was installed, they would be so happy as though they had the whole world. Little Momo's test results were indeed as the doctor had said. It was indeed a viral cold. There was not a big problem. Feng Ling was relieved and got up to find the bathroom. After all, she had stayed up all night and was a little sleepy. She wanted to wash her face with cold water. Chapter 1350. As soon as she walked out of the bathroom, she suddenly heard the heart-wrenching cries of adults coming from the pediatric emergency room in the distance. Feng Ling felt that something seemed to have happened there. She didn't have the habit of meddling in other people's business, but most of the children in this kind of pediatric emergency room were children, so she subconsciously walked over. A little boy about 1 year old with a pale face was pushed in on the bed. Next to him, he should be the child's parents. He kept crying and shouting. He seemed to be a native of Washington and spoke American English. Hearing the conversation of the medical staff from afar, she learned that the child accidentally swallowed a small coin, and it was stuck in his throat. Seeing that the child's snow-white skin had been choked to purple, and listening to the adult's cries, Feng Ling frowned and inexplicably panicked in her heart. Such a small child. Suddenly, a figure walked quickly from the back of the crowd and quickly picked up the child from the bed that was being pushed. Then, he turned the child around and made the child lie on his stomach. Nurses rushed over from all directions. After all, the doctors in the emergency room were so busy that they could not separate themselves from receiving patients. When they suddenly saw such a person suddenly coming over and using such a professional first aid technique, they were all stunned. When Feng Ling approached and saw the tall man, her expression did not change, but a trace of hesitation flashed across her brows. Dr. Wen? When Linhan was not wearing a white coat, but a simple shirt and trousers. He had many private hospitals under his name. He definitely wouldn't work in this hospital in Washington, and judging from his clothes, he shouldn't be a doctor here. However, his technique was professional and fast. Before anyone could react, his hand had already patted the child's back. In less than a minute, the child suddenly began to vomit with great difficulty. Then, with a forceful movement of crying and vomiting, The coin that almost took his life suddenly fell out of his mouth. Although the coin finally came out, the child's face had turned blue, and he was still very weak. When Linhan didn't say much, he got up and put the child back on the bed. With a few simple words, he signaled the nurse to quickly push the child into the emergency room. The children's families were also stunned. After thanking him, they hurriedly followed him into the emergency room. When Linhan didn't say much but glanced over there. When he turned around, he suddenly paused, turned his eyes and met Feng Ling's eyes. When Feng Ling came back to herself, when Linhan was already looking at her. Obviously, he was quite surprised that she was here. However, this expressionless man only watched her for a moment before walking over. Feng Ling. Dr. Wen. Feng Ling remembered that before when Liqing left, she had told her not to let anyone find little Momo. From the child's expression and appearance, she could tell that Momo was Wen Liqing and Wen Linhan's child. However, Wen Liqing had told her that although she didn't know what had happened between the two of them, since she had agreed, she had to hide it for Wen Liqing. Although she didn't know why she had to hide it. Why are you here? Wen Linhan asked. I have some work in Washington. A friend's child is sick, so I came to take a look, Feng Ling said simply. Wen Linhan nodded. And me too. A friend's child had a high fever in the middle of the night and was sent to the hospital for emergency treatment. They were panicking and didn't trust the doctors here. They insisted that I come to take a look, so I came. As he spoke, Wen Linhan looked at Feng Ling with a faint smile. Speaking of your work in Washington, I just remembered that you're now the Feng Corporation's. Feng Ling curved her lips lightly. Fate is not in my control. A few years ago, I didn't expect my life to turn out like this. Let's not talk about these changes, but why are you in Washington? What she really wanted to ask was, did Wen Linhan know that little Momo was here? Recently, the Medical Research Center in Washington developed a vaccine for a new virus. I came to take a look. Feng Ling looked at Wen Linhan and recalled everything that Dr. Wen had done in the base, as well as her understanding of Wen Linhan. Although she did not know much about him, although her life experience was not that rich, she could still feel that Dr. Wen was a very gentle and peaceful man. No matter how far his relationship with Wen Liqing went, Wen Liqing should not have stopped him from meeting the child. Could it be? Just as Feng Ling was deep in thought, little Momo's voice suddenly came from behind. Sister. Little Momo refused to call her auntie, and always called her sister. This crisp voice caused Feng Ling's expression to falter. She turned her eyes abruptly, and saw little Momo running toward her with his cute short legs. Yuzheng followed closely behind, and mouthed to tell her that little Momo could not stay in the ward anymore, and wanted to come out to look for her. Feng Ling turned around and subconsciously wanted to cover little Momo's face. But although the little guy's legs were short, he ran quite fast. He pounced all the way to her leg and hugged it, refusing to let go. At this moment, when Linhan lowered his head to look at the little radish head wrapped around Feng Ling's leg, he did not see his face clearly. This is your friend's child? He's so young. How old is he? Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. In an instant, an answer seemed to surge into her heart. When Liqing had told him not to let anyone else find little Momo, and it seemed like she was avoiding Wen Linhan. Li Nanheng did not explain any of this, but from some ambiguous things, he guessed that Wen Liqing did not want Wen Linhan to find the child. But, could it be that Wen Linhan did not know of the child's existence at all? Could it be that Wen Liqing had been hiding it from Wen Linhan from her pregnancy, to giving birth to the child, to when little Momo was 2 years old? Feng Ling picked little Momo up, and pressed his little head into her arms. After confirming that Wen Linhan would not see the child's face, she turned to look at him. Yes, my friend's child. Is it also a high fever? Recently, most children's illnesses are like this, Wen Linhan said and walked over. As Wen Linhan spoke, he walked over and lowered his head to look at little Momo, who was obediently lying in Feng Ling's arms. Seeing his obedient appearance and burning red ears, he smiled faintly and reached out to touch his soft little mushroom head. Let uncle see if the fever is serious. Feng Ling was about to say no, but little Momo suddenly turned his head from her arms and turned his face to Wen Linhan. Chapter 1351. Little Momo's face was facing Wen Linhan. His black, grape-like eyes carefully sized up the gentle-looking uncle standing beside Feng Ling. Then he blinked and timidly buried his face in Feng Ling's arms, hugging Feng Ling tightly with his short, white arms. From the moment the child turned his head and buried his face again, the gentle expression in Wen Linhan's eyes changed from hesitation to clarity. He abruptly raised his eyes to look at Feng Ling, who was also hugging the child tightly. Dr. Wen, I'm sorry. This child is still having a fever. I'll send him back to the ward to rest first. If we have a chance to meet again, we'll contact each other again. With that, Feng Ling turned to leave with the child in her arms. Wen Linhan did not chase after her. He just stood there and looked at Feng Ling's back. He then looked at the arms and legs of the child in her arms, and his clear eyes gradually deepened. Yuzheng. Feng Ling quickly walked up to Yuzheng. In order to calm Wen Linhan's doubts, she could not leave immediately. She could only send the child to Yuzheng's arms. Send Momo back to the ward. I want to talk to that gentleman. All right, Miss Feng. Yuzheng raised his hand and took the child, but Feng Ling covered little Momo's face with her hand, but she could not do it too deliberately. After Yuzheng left with the child, Feng Ling pondered for a moment and turned around. She saw that Wen Linhan was standing in place, looking deeply at Yuzheng, who had taken the child away. Feng Ling walked back. Dr. Wen, if it's convenient, let's go outside and sit. Wen Linhan looked down at her. There was clearly something in his eyes, but he was never someone who would show his emotions on the surface. Hearing Feng Ling's words, his gaze fell on her face. The child looks very familiar. Feng Ling did not avoid his words, nor did she answer directly. She only pointed in the direction of the hospital door with her eyes. Wen Linhan did not say anything more. He turned and walked out. Outside the hospital, Feng Ling was blown by the cold wind. She felt a little more clear-headed about the whole thing. What's wrong with the child? Wen Linhan didn't waste any time. He stood beside her expressionlessly and looked straight into her eyes, not giving her any chance to lie. Feng Ling was silent for a moment before asking, "What did you see? Is there still a need to look? A face says everything." Wen Linhan's eyes were cold. "I'm afraid there is no second face in this world that looks so much like me and her. Especially since I grew up with her. I know very well what she looked like when she was a child, and what I looked like when I was a child. To be honest, I don't know what happened, but now the child is entrusted to me. Firstly, I can't answer your questions, and secondly, I can't give the child to you. I can't contact Wen Liqing now. You should know my character. The mission I received is to fight to the death. It's the same for this child. Since she asked me to protect her and not let anyone take her away. Now even if you put a knife on my neck, I can't give her to you." Wen Linhan stared at her. "I know you're not a liar." Feng Ling smiled lightly. "Indeed, it's difficult for me to hide anything, but I really don't know what happened." "What do you know?" Feng Ling turned to look at him. "I met this child by chance some time ago. At that time, Xiaoqing didn't show up in front of me and left the child with me in a panic. Before she left, she sent me a message asking me to take care of the child. I'm indebted to her, so I'll definitely do my best to take good care of this child. As for the rest, I don't know what happened to her, and why she hid everywhere and left the child with me." When Linhan's cold brows slowly furrowed, she was very flustered and needed to hide everywhere? "I can tell from her text message that it's probably like this, but I'm not entirely sure," Feng Ling said and looked up at Wen Linhan. Feng Ling said and looked up at Wen Linhan. From his expression, it seemed that he didn't know what had happened to Wen Liqing in the past 2 years. "How long has it been since you contacted her? Don't you know what happened to her?" Feng Ling asked. Wen Linhan put one hand in his trouser pocket and sneered self-deprecatingly. "If I knew, how could I have come to this point?" Feng Ling was even more surprised at this moment. So what exactly happened between them? Wasn't it always Wen Liqing who chased after Wen Linhan? She had chased after him for so many years. Even though Wen Linhan had always avoided her enthusiasm, Wen Liqing's heart had always been with him. What was going on now? Feng Ling had always been slow in matters of the heart. At this moment, she didn't understand and didn't dare to guess. She just looked at Wen Linhan. She's married. When Linhan looked deeply at the cars driving by in the distance in the early morning. 2.5 years ago, she broke off all ties with me and left freely. She kept saying that she wanted to live a new life from now on, and completely get rid of all the emotional shadows I brought to her. 2.5 years. Feng Ling paused. At that time, when Liqing should have been pregnant for a few months. She didn't say it out loud, but when Linhan must have known the situation at that time. When Liqing was pregnant with his child, and kept saying that she wanted to get rid of him. Did something happen to the Wen family or her? Feng Ling asked cautiously. When Linhan didn't answer, but stood there silently. No one knew what he was thinking. She looked at this man who was filled with a deep coldness, and then thought of how when Liqing had no choice but to temporarily hand the child over to her. If there was still someone in the Wen family who Wen Liqing could entrust her to, why would he hand the child over to her? From this, it could be seen that something must have happened to the Wen family. But it seemed like when Linhan didn't want to say this. He wasn't good at telling others about his matters, and so was Feng Ling. The two of them stood in front of the hospital in silence for a long time. When the sun rose in the east and the coldness of the early morning subsided slightly, the phone in Feng Ling's pocket vibrated. She took it out, and saw that it was a message from Yu Zheng. He said that little Momo's forehead was sweating. He had just called the doctor over to take a look, and his fever had successfully subsided. Feng Ling heaved a sigh of relief, and put her phone back into her pocket. When Lin Han, who didn't see the contents of her phone, asked, "The child's fever has subsided? I want to chat with more like-minded people about, young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant W. 4M." Chapter 1352. Feng Ling turned to look at him. After all, he was a doctor. He should be very familiar with the child's high fever. He also knew when the fever would subside. She nodded. Yes, the fever has gone down. Let me take a look at the test results. When Linhan was not in a hurry to ask to see little Momo. Instead, he handed his hand to Feng Ling. Feng Ling looked at him, and did not give it to him. I'm a doctor, he said calmly. After the child's fever subsides, you have to bring him to the consultation room, and ask the doctor to take another look. I'll take a look at the test results. I didn't ask you to hand the child over to me immediately. Is there a problem? He was too calm. So calm that Feng Ling felt that he must have found out everything that Wen Liqing had hidden from her over the years in these short 2 hours. However, he did not show it on his face. At this moment, he only wanted to look at the test results. She took out the test results from her pocket and handed them to him. When Linhan took it, looked at the medication and all the test results and said, "Did the doctor prescribe antivirus medicine for him?" "Yes, I'll take him to breakfast later. I think it's oral liquid." "All right." When Linhan looked at the name on the test results. When Shimo, 2 years old. 2 years old. That absurd night 3 years ago was clearly engraved in his mind. When Linhan looked at the test results silently, he did not look at Feng Ling, but only stared at the things in his hand. It's a cold. Normal medicine. These test results are useless. Can I take them away? Yes. This thing didn't have much use. Since when Linhan already knew the truth, he didn't mind him taking them away. After all, little Momo's name, age, and some blood tests were written on it. There was nothing else that couldn't be taken away. Seeing that she answered so readily, when Linhan carefully folded the test results and held them in his hand, he glanced at her again. I'll go in to see the child. No. This time she answered readily. When Linhan frowned coldly, you know very well the relationship between this child and me. I even concealed his birth and his existence for 2 years. Now that I know it, can't I even take a good look at him? Dr. Wen, based on my understanding of you, I believe you are a very good person, but I have never understood the relationship between you and Wen Liqing. Feng Ling said softly. If she hadn't entrusted the child to me, I wouldn't have meddled in other people's business. But now that she has handed the child to me, I have to do what I promised her. You can't take this child away, nor can you see him. I can't see my son? When Linhan's eyes turned cold. Feng Ling, what would I do to my own son to make you worried? Not really, Feng Ling said calmly. But when Lecheng chose to hand the child to me when she had no choice, but to hand him over to you, this means that the whole thing is not as simple as I thought. She naturally has her reasons for not letting you see the child. Furthermore, Momo is very obedient to his mother. If I ask him to follow me, he will obediently follow me. Now that you suddenly appeared, even if you say you are his father in front of him, I'm afraid he won't leave with you. When Linhan did not speak for a while, and just looked at her, Feng Ling did not budge an inch. Just now he called you sister? When Linhan suddenly asked softly, yes, I've taught him many times to call me auntie, but he likes to call me sister. Little Momo's mouth is very sweet, and he's very good at coaxing adults. He's especially cute and sensible. Usually, when I ask him to obediently follow auntie, he will obediently follow. He won't run around or eat anything. When he's sick, he will only hug me and cry when he's in pain. When he's sick, he won't keep crying. He's very obedient and a very likable child. When Linhan smiled, all right, Dr. 1. This time, he caught a cold because the virus is too contagious. He became like this after going to the amusement park once. In the future, I will pay attention to prevent him from going to places with too many people during the flu season. In short, don't worry. He's very safe with me. If you want to bring the child to your side, the first thing you have to do is to find the child's mother. When she left America, it was no different from running for her life. I've already guessed the reason. When Linhan said indifferently, and looked at Feng Ling seriously, I know very well what to do. Take good care of him. I can't thank you enough. Feng Ling smiled and shook her head. Miss Wen saved my life before. You also saved my life when you were at the base. There's no such thing as gratitude. The child is very adorable. Anyway, I won't mistreat him. When Feng Ling returned to the ward, little Momo had just been fed breakfast by Yu Zheng. Although he had only eaten some light porridge, the child's complexion looked much better after his fever subsided. She walked over to sit by the bed, raised her hand, and gently pinched little Momo's face. Then she smiled and teased him for a while. The child was in a good state. He smiled and pounced into her arms. Feng Ling recalled Dr. Wen's gaze, and then looked at the adorable little guy in her arms. She leaned close to his ear and whispered, Momo, do you want daddy? Little Momo played with the buttons on her clothes with his fingers in her arms, but as he played with them, he shook his head vigorously. Seeing his determined shake of his head, Feng Ling was puzzled. Why? Daddy hit mommy. When little Momo said this, he raised his little hand to tug at Feng Ling's collar. I don't want daddy. Mommy's head is bleeding. Daddy hit me. Feng Ling's expression instantly froze. She abruptly turned to look at Yu Zheng, who was also stunned. Yu Zheng was in disbelief. Does this mean that little Momo's mother has lived in domestic violence for a long time? Feng Ling didn't say anything. She lowered her head and asked little Momo a few more questions, but the child refused to answer more about the role of his father. She didn't ask any more questions, and called Qin Ship to ask her to send someone to investigate the Wen family in Los Angeles in recent years. After noon, little Momo had been sent back to the hotel. After taking his medicine, he had already fallen asleep. Feng Ling saw the caller ID on her phone, and walked out with her phone. From this call, she learned that 3 years ago, something happened to the Wen family, and the family was destroyed. However, she didn't know what happened. After that, Wen Lecheng suddenly married a wealthy Chinese businessman in Los Angeles. That wealthy businessman was in the jewelry business. The man Wen Lecheng married was more than 10 years older than her. He used to be a very good-tempered person, but later, he became addicted to drugs and had a bad temper. He was even exposed by the media for beating and scolding his wife in his company's jewelry store. However, the media news was quickly suppressed. I want to chat with more like-minded people about young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant W. 4M. Chapter 1353. If these things had not been investigated in depth, it would not have been easily discovered. That was because the Chinese tycoon's reputation in Los Angeles was not low at the time. They were able to suppress all the news in the media. It was obvious that they were indeed capable. However, if he specially investigated further, all the old things that had been hidden could not be hidden. But who would specially investigate the story of a down-and-out girl? Who would care about the story of a down-and-out girl who was often subjected to domestic violence? Since Wen Leching had said that she had severed all ties with Dr. Wen and refused to tell him what had happened for so many years, with Dr. Wen's temper, he would definitely not pester her or investigate anything. Right now, he would definitely be able to find out what she could find out. It was hard to imagine that Wen Leching, who was so beautiful back then, had lived like this in the past few years. It was even harder to imagine what Wen Linhan would do if he found out about all this. After Feng Ling learned about everything, she stood in the living room of the hotel room for a long time. When she returned to the bedroom, she saw that little Momo was sleeping soundly. She couldn't help but recall that little Momo said he didn't want a father, because his father would beat his mother. He even said that his mother's head was bleeding. Such a young child had seen all of this with his own eyes. Was that Chinese businessman a lunatic? Hitting his mother in front of a child? Wen Leching was supposed to be a very rational person. Except for her feelings for Wen Linhan, she had always been very rational in everything she did. She was a person who had received such a good education. Furthermore, Momo was Wen Linhan's child and had nothing to do with that man. What happened to her back then? Why did she choose such a path? After little Momo woke up, Feng Ling accompanied him for dinner. After confirming that the child was fine, she rushed back to the company overnight. In 2 days, she would return to New York. When she returned, she would bring little Momo back with her. There were still many things to be busy with. She had stayed up all night in the hospital yesterday, and she still had things to do tonight, so she couldn't sleep. Qin Shuk could no longer hold it in. She closed her eyes on the sofa in the office for a while. Feng Ling supported her forehead with one hand and sat behind the desk to read the documents. She had almost sorted out the matters regarding Tming, but there was still some work to be done. When the sky was about to brighten, Feng Ling could not hold on any longer after almost 48 hours of not resting. She leaned on the table and closed her eyes for a while. Half an hour later, she suddenly woke up and continued working. After being busy for 2 days, he finally managed to negotiate a deal worth 100 million with all his sincerity before he left. After coming to Washington for the past few days, although he did not get $1 billion in financing, he had a project worth 300 to 400 million in all aspects. This trip was not in vain. The key was the successful recovery of Tming, which could be regarded as an additional few hundred million in liquidity. This urgent situation was temporarily resolved. On the way back to New York, little Momo sat in Feng Ling's car. She held the child in her arms and closed her eyes to sleep for a while. Suddenly her phone rang. She closed her eyes and pressed the phone to her ear. She listened for a while. It was the company's higher-ups. They had many important things to discuss about Tming. She spoke a few words in a half-awake state before putting down the phone. The car continued to drive, but she could not sleep. Little Momo slept soundly. Feng Ling lowered her head to look at the lit phone screen. She opened the recent call records and found Li Nanheng's private number. Even though she had not been able to contact him in the past few days, and the few times she had called, no one answered or there was no signal, she would still call him every day when she was free. After all, she still had something to ask him about Tming. This time, the other party's phone was turned off. She called 3 times in a row, but his phone was turned off. Feng Ling lowered her head to look at the call that had been automatically cut off because the other party had turned off his phone. She watched as the phone screen turned from bright to dark. Qin Shuk sat in the front passenger seat and slept for a while. Hearing the commotion behind her, she narrowed her eyes and looked back at her. Seeing that Feng Ling was staring at her phone in a daze, she couldn't help rubbing her swollen forehead and saying, "Haven't contacted Li Nanheng yet?" Feng Ling did not answer. These past few days, everyone had been working hard and didn't have much time to chat. She only took the time to make a few calls occasionally. She couldn't get anything from Yu Zheng, and she couldn't contact Xiao Su. Li Nanheng seemed to have suddenly disappeared. Based on her years of instinct, the disappearance of a person like Li Nanheng was definitely not simple. Something must have happened. However, another voice told her that no news was the best news. After all, he had left the base a long time ago just like her. His arm injury last time might have been an accident, and it was impossible for anything else to find him. Perhaps he had just been too busy in the company recently. After all, she had been so busy for days and nights that she didn't touch the phone and only sat in the office reading documents. At that time, many people thought she had gone missing, but in the end, they found her in the pile of documents in the office. New York. After all, Dr. Wen already knew of little Momo's existence. Right now there was no need to hide or avoid anyone. In order to ensure little Momo's safety, Feng Ling sent the child to the Feng family's villa and asked the two elders of the Feng family, who longed for a child to accompany them, to take care of him. On the other hand, she returned to the company to continue her work. On the second day after returning to New York, a local financial company in New York suddenly sent someone to discuss a 1 billion financing contract with her. When Qin Shuk heard the news, she jumped up and shouted that the heavens had eyes. She actually had 1 billion yuan of financing when she needed it the most. While Feng Ling was discussing the contract with someone, she was thinking about the recent events and this billion yuan financing contract. Why was everything so agreeable to her? If this matter had something to do with Li Nanheng, he hadn't shown up recently, but it was true that after that night in the resort, everything seemed to develop naturally. It was impossible to say that it had nothing to do with him. But if it had something to do with him, what did it mean that he hadn't appeared these days? In the conference room, Feng Ling was discussing the project with the investor. Halfway through the meeting, there was a commotion outside. The door of the conference room was suddenly knocked open. Tam and Lin Cheng rushed in with guns in their hands. A few security guards who had been beaten black and blue followed in, shouting, "CEO Feng, these two people rushed into the company to see you. We saw that they didn't seem to have good intentions, and went forward to stop them." In the end, these two people suddenly panicked and rushed in with guns. The moment Feng Ling saw that it was Tam and Lin Cheng, her gaze froze. Before she could speak, Tam suddenly said with red eyes, "Something happened to Boss Li and Kay. We don't know if they're dead or alive. We've been looking for them for days and nights." A string in Feng Ling's mind suddenly snapped. She abruptly stood up from behind the conference table. "I want to chat with more like-minded people about, young Master Mo, have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant W. For M." Chapter 1354. The executives and partners at the conference table turned pale with fright because of the two men who rushed in with guns. The moment Feng Ling suddenly stood up, they were all stunned. "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and call the police." An executive looked at the guns in Tam and Lin Cheng's hands and ordered loudly with a frown, "I've already called the police." The security guard quickly answered. Feng Ling acted as though she didn't hear anything. She stared at Tam and Lin Cheng. What happened? Seeing that CEO Feng seemed to know these two people and didn't seem to mind the guns in their hands, they immediately looked at each other, not knowing what had happened. Tam looked at Feng Ling with bloodshot eyes. His lips trembled, and he held the gun tightly in his hand. When the security guard by the side instinctively wanted to come over, he glared fiercely at him. "Don't touch them." After speaking calmly, Feng Ling lowered her eyes again and looked at the cooperation document by her hand. If she didn't calculate wrongly, this kind of financing project couldn't be approved immediately. It must have been arranged when she was in Washington. It wasn't until the other party's financing salary was ready that she came over today. However, in fact, whether it was Tming or the money that could support the entire Feng Corporation, everything had already been arranged for her. "The meeting will be adjourned for now. I'm sorry. If your company can accept it, you can call my cousin, Vice President Qin, over to continue the conversation." "Sure. If Miss Feng has something urgent, you can call the other people in charge of your company over. It's all right. From the looks of your two friends, something big must have happened. We can understand." Although the person in charge of the financing company was frightened by the two men with guns, he saw that they didn't seem to have any intention of hurting anyone. Seeing Feng Ling's expression, he more or less understood. Under normal circumstances, partners who could provide such a huge amount of financing wouldn't have such a good temper. As the CEO of a company, they could still accept Feng Ling leaving halfway through the discussion of the financing project. She really didn't believe that someone had played a role in this financing. Li Nanheng, what did she say and do in front of him that night when she was drunk? Thank you. Feng Ling put down the document in her hand and decisively ordered her assistant to call Qin Shuk over. She then glanced at Tam and Lin Cheng, who were still standing there, and gave them a look. Follow me. After Feng Ling and the two young men with guns left, everyone in the conference room looked at each other again. After leaving the conference room, the corner in front of the corridor was very quiet. There were no employees coming or going. Feng Ling turned back to look at the two of them. What exactly happened? Tam's eyes were still red. Actually, the base normally sends members to countries at war to carry out rescue missions. But we didn't expect that there would be chemical poisoning in Israel. There are many old people in the base, and most of them are from Team 3. They asked for orders to go on a mission, but they fell into the enemy's trap and were all locked up. Moreover, those chemical drugs are very harmful to the human body, and some are dead or disabled. When the elite team was sent to support, although they were wary and wore gas masks, they also faced the same situation. Those chemical drugs were not only in the aura, but also hidden in the explosives. They would corrode people's hands and feet, and the scene was very... Feng Ling had goosebumps as she listened. She looked at Tam, and then at Lin Cheng. Lin Cheng just stood at the side with red eyes. He usually didn't talk much. Although Tam was rambling, he could at least explain the whole thing clearly. Just as the base was about to send more than 10 helicopters to pick up the surviving brothers from Israel, Boss heard about the situation at the base and rushed back overnight. Xiao Su, Han Jin, and some of the elite team members also boarded the helicopter. We were supposed to go with Kay, but there was a serious case in Los Angeles that needed snipers to cooperate with the arrest. So Lin Cheng and I didn't go to Israel. I didn't expect the situation over there to be so dangerous. Han Jin and the others risked their lives to rescue the members of the elite team. Kay was injured by explosives mixed with chemicals and was shot down by the helicopter. Boss couldn't bear to see Kay abandoned there, so he went to save Kay alone despite everyone's obstruction. But what happened? Feng Ling's expression was calm. Her fingers were not clenched together, but her fingers remained stiff as she stared at Tam. In the end, the place where Kay had an accident was a chemical explosion area, and there was a river next to it. When the explosion sounded, all the planes that took off almost malfunctioned and fell. He suddenly interrupted. Boss and Kay didn't come back with the helicopter. When Han Jin and the others returned with injuries, they were all unconscious because of the chemical poison. They have all been hospitalized for treatment. The remaining brothers who were in good condition told us about the situation at that time. They only said that Boss and Kay would be in danger if they stayed there. But in order to protect most of the base from being heavily damaged, they could only let everyone go back first. Boss, Kay, and the others were left there because they couldn't be found at that time. It's been so many days, and it's unknown whether they're dead or alive. It's been so many days now, and we don't know if they're dead or alive. They said they don't know if they're dead or alive. Han Jin and the others were only choked by the thick smoke of the chemicals in midair. When they came back, they were all hospitalized for treatment. Kay and Boss were in the explosion area. We may not be the most powerful in the base, but I believe that with your feelings for Boss, you definitely won't be able to accept this result. The two of us want to go to Israel to look for Boss and Kay, but the base doesn't allow it. We can only violate the rules of the base and take the risk. We didn't come here because we wanted you to go with us, but because you've always been one with us. You have the right to know everything. Whether Lin Cheng and I can come back or not, I'm afraid the base won't be able to keep us. But for Boss and Kay, we have to go. As they spoke, Tam and Lin Cheng suddenly took out 2 silver nameplates and handed them to her. If we can't come back, please let Ah Feng hang our nameplates in front of the base hall. We can't return to the base if we're alive, but if we die, let our souls stay there. I want to chat with more like-minded people about, young Master Mo, have you kissed enough? Talk about life, and find a confidant W. 4M. Chapter 1355. Feng Ling was silent for a moment before raising her hand to take the 2 silver brands. Tam and Lin Cheng watched her and put the gun into their pockets. They were clearly prepared to leave and step into Israel at any time. Feng Ling's fingers gently stroked the 2 brands. Then, she abruptly took out a silver brand that was the same as theirs from her pocket. She placed it together with the other 2 and held it in her palm. Seeing her actions, Tam and Lin Cheng did not speak for a long time. They just looked at her. I've left the base for a long time, but thankfully when I left this thing was still on me. I haven't worn it much in the past few years, but it has always been in my pocket, she said calmly. Just as you said, 11 base and the sniper team are one. As for the relationship between Li Nanheng and me, she paused and suddenly smiled. She looked at them silently. I'm very grateful that you didn't hide it from me. I'm even more grateful that you came to tell me before you left, and gave me a chance to return to the base. Tam and Lin Cheng both understood that Feng Ling had no chance of returning to the base after her registration was removed. Unless, as they had said earlier, she couldn't go back. After she died, the brand could go back. Feng Ling, we're not bringing you to die. We're here to entrust. It's the same. Who says we'll definitely die if we go? Feng Ling looked at them with clear eyes. Back then, Kay brought me into the base. All these years, all of you have been indispensable to my life. You're my best companions. My temper is too cold and my personality is stubborn, but it doesn't mean that I don't love Li Nanheng. If anything happens to them, I can't absolve myself from the blame. I'll send someone to explain to Ah Feng. I'll arrange a ticket to Israel right now. Feng Ling picked up her phone. You can't go. I can. If anything happens to you, Boss Li, every time something happens to me, your Boss Li will appear. I want to see if he will suddenly appear if something really happens to me in Israel. Feng Ling said as though she was joking. But there was no smile in her eyes. She quickly clicked on her phone to find the nearest flight time. Tam and Lin Cheng really didn't come here to make her follow them. They really didn't want Feng Ling to be kept in the dark after being forced to leave the base for so long. After all, she still had the Feng family and the company behind her. She had a lot of responsibilities. She shouldn't leave with them. However, he did not expect her to choose the base, and Li Nanheng without hesitation between the Feng Corporation and the base. Feng Ling right now after all. Feng Ling still looked down at her phone. As she booked the plane ticket, she said calmly, the Feng family has already walked out of the trough. Although Qin Shuk is my cousin, she can also help me take care of the Feng family's elders. Although it's a little selfish to do so, according to my own life, why do I have to be responsible for everyone? In the past few years, all my hard work and hard support are enough for me to repay this debt of childbirth. I don't know anyone but Li Nanheng. The Feng family is going downhill. They can still have a lot, but Li Nanheng is somewhere in Israel. He only has me. He's waiting for us to save him. Feng Ling raised her cell phone and showed them the flight time displayed on it. Everyone had been in the base for so long, so Feng Ling was familiar with the identity of each of the brothers around her. She booked a plane ticket very quickly and didn't need to ask for any passport number because she remembered them all. Tam and Lin Cheng were speechless. On one hand, they were excited by Feng Ling's decision. They couldn't tell if they were worried that something would happen to her with them, or if they were sighing that Feng Ling was still the same Feng Ling. However, they were still a little vexed. If they rushed into the Feng Corporation to let her know this, wouldn't it be too unfair to her already peaceful life? However, Feng Ling seemed to know what they were thinking. She silently took off the lady's suit jacket and slowly unbuttoned the delicate cufflinks of the lady's shirt. Her voice was clear and firm as she said, I should thank you for freeing me. Due to the dispute, Jerusalem was the shared capital of Israel and Palestine. This place was also one of the largest arms suppliers in the world. After the plane landed, Feng Ling, Tam, and Lin Cheng rented an off-road vehicle with a lot of space near the airport and drove all the way to Jerusalem. In recent years, there have been constant battles here, but because it was an ancient city, there were still many tourists who had feelings for this place who came to take photos. After arriving at the ancient city, there was a war zone. Feng Ling sat behind the car and looked in that direction. Suddenly, she saw a helicopter appear above the zone. Helicopters were very common in this kind of place. At first, no one paid much attention to it. However, as the helicopter flew, it suddenly fell toward the empty space in front of it. It was a large open space, and a group of tourists was walking past it. The black plane fell down with flames and the shadow of death. At the same time, a scream erupted from the crowd. The people around them screamed and scattered in all directions. Feng Ling looked in the direction of the open space and was about to speak when Tam keenly sensed the situation. He quickly turned the car around and plunged into the bushes by the side. At the same time, the off-road vehicle's engine died, and it was stuck motionlessly in the bushes. At this moment, a large hole was drilled out of the bushes, and the front of the car was embedded in it. Tam knocked hard on the steering wheel and cursed. It stuck. At the same time, under the scorching sun of dusk, the red flames dyed half of the sky. Feng Ling turned her head and saw the scene of people scattering like birds and beasts. All of a sudden, she saw a little girl from an unknown country. Perhaps because of the sudden chaos, she was separated from her parents by someone. She was standing in the open space, rubbing her eyes and crying in a daze. The child was about 3 or 4 years old. She was knocked to the ground by the person behind her. The shadow above the child's head grew larger and larger. She didn't know how to dodge, and because of the pain in her leg, she couldn't stand up. She could only sit on the ground and cry in a daze. Helpless and pitiful, she was a small ball. Feng Ling's palms instantly broke out in cold sweat. She opened the car door and ignored Lin Cheng and Tam's shouts and warnings. She leaped in that direction. She wanted to talk about young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough with more like-minded people? Talk about life and find a confidant W. 4M. Chapter 1356. Feng Ling, don't go. It's too dangerous. Accompanied by Tam and Lin Cheng's shouts, the helicopter had already smashed into the ground. It was only about 10 meters away from the little girl on the ground. Seeing that the helicopter was about to crash and die, Feng Ling's figure had already nimbly leaped over. She picked up the little girl on the ground and pounced toward the haystack by the side without any regard for anything else. Feng Ling's speed was not as fast as when she was in the base, but it was not slow either. At the very least, when she held the little girl in her arms and pressed her against the haystack, she heard the sound of the helicopter crashing behind her. It was enough to prove that she had really saved her. The little girl in her arms was crying. Feng Ling quickly turned back and saw that the place where the plane landed was exactly where the little girl had fallen. A loud explosion rang in her ears, and the earth seemed to tremble crazily at this moment. Feng Ling patted the little girl in her arms. The little girl was already scared silly. She raised her head in her arms. Close your eyes, Feng Ling said softly. Feng Ling said in a low voice and picked up the little girl again. When she turned around, she saw a dazzling fire in front of her. When the plane crashed and exploded, the second explosion and the soaring flames were inevitable. Precisely because of this, the surrounding people were still fleeing in panic. Feng Ling closed her eyes from the thick smoke and quickly retreated with the little girl, who did not understand her words, in her arms. Tam suddenly rushed over and rushed to Feng Ling under the flames. He opened the car door and shouted, "Hurry up and get in!" Feng Ling carried the little girl into the car, and the off-road vehicle quickly drove away, leaving this dangerous area. Even after bringing the girl to a safe area, Feng Ling still coughed a few times in the car. Are you all right? Lin Cheng sat in the front passenger seat and handed her a bottle of water. Feng Ling took the water and turned to look at the child who had been crying in fright. She brought the water to her mouth and didn't know which country she was from. She whispered into her ear and tried to ask in the languages she knew. In the end, she confirmed that she seemed to be a child from a British family. After comforting the child, she quickly called Tam to drive the car to the British Embassy in Jerusalem and temporarily handed the child over. She didn't know when the child's parents would come to find her. After instructing the child, Feng Ling walked out of the embassy. Her throat was very uncomfortable. She went to the car to get a bottle of water. After drinking a few sips, she felt much better. At the same time, the hand holding the water bottle paused. She abruptly raised her eyes to look at Tam. Where was the accident between Kay and Bosley? You said there's a river nearby, didn't you? They had an accident about 40 kilometers away from here. There is indeed a river there. I choked on the smoke from the explosion when the plane crashed. My throat has been dry and painful. In the area where the chemical detonated, if they still had a chance of survival, they would definitely choose the water route. Feng Ling said as she quickly got into the car. Let's go take a look. Feng has already thought about this. He has already sent people to search along the river. But at the end of the river is a very high waterfall cliff. Tam's voice became hoarse. If it's there, there's no chance of survival. Even if we firmly believe that Boss and Kay are still alive, we can only choose another route. The water route is definitely no longer feasible. It works. Feng Ling directly capped the mineral water bottle again and went to the driver's seat. She looked at the two people outside the car. Or rent another car. You guys go by land. I'll go by water. That definitely won't work. I can't let you go alone. Lin Qing said and jumped into the back seat. Let's go to the water route to take a look, in case there really is a miracle. Tam no longer had any objections. He got into the car, but when he sat in the front passenger seat, he glanced at Feng Ling. I'll drive. It's fine. You've been driving all the way. Rest for a while. We'll take turns. Feng Ling looked at the road ahead. It was barren everywhere. The sunlight was bright and dazzling. She took the sunglasses from Tam and put them on. Tam looked at her by the side. Aren't these sunglasses a little big for you? It was indeed a little big, but Feng Ling had long hair tied behind her head. Her eyes and legs could be pinned to her hair and wouldn't fall off for the time being. It's fine. It's much better than the sunlight. As Feng Ling spoke, she reached out to search for the direction on the navigator and pointed at the red dot on it. It's here, right? Yes, Boss's accident happened here, but so many days have passed. If he's still alive, he must be very far away, Tam said. Let's get there first, then slowly search along the waterway and the surroundings. Feng Ling quickly stepped on the accelerator according to the direction of the navigation. At the same time she said, contact the base and see what routes they've searched before. Don't waste time. Don't repeat the useless route. We've already fallen out with the base. We came out on our own. How could the base? Can't you ask a few people you're close to in private? If you put this kind of thing on the table, not to mention Feng, even if Boss is in the base, the result will be the same. However, a human life is at stake. Even if you contact Feng in private, he will still tell you. Feng Ling frowned. Lin Qing paused for a moment and quickly picked up his phone to contact the people at the base. In the end, it was indeed the electronic map that Feng had sent them. All the routes marked in red were the ones that they had sent people to search, and the locations were all there. As Feng Ling drove, she listened to the route that Tam and Lin Qing were talking about. She controlled the steering wheel with one hand and quickly marked the navigation on the car with the other. She could mark almost all the locations that the two of them mentioned at the same time. In the end, all of them appeared on the navigation device. The waterway. The location they're looking for ends in the area of the waterfall, Feng Ling said as she drove. When we pass by a car rental place later, let's rent 2 more cars. We'll split into 3 groups. I'll go to the waterfall. You guys go to the other 2 unexplored routes. That place is too dangerous. How can I let you go? Below the waterfall is an ancient jungle. Have you lived in the jungle before? Feng Ling asked. I'll go myself. You guys go to the other routes. Listen to me. Even though Feng Ling was no different from before, her tone had more or less become a high-ranking leader. She could not be refused. I'll go by water. You guys choose these 2 routes. We'll meet at the final location in 48 hours. She wanted to talk about young Master Mo. Have you kissed enough with more like-minded people? Talk about life and find a confidant W. 4M. Chapter 1357. Feng Ling drove alone in the direction of the river near where Li Nanhing disappeared. This was no longer the urban area of Jerusalem, but it was even more chaotic than the urban area. Feng Ling's car was like an arrow's bowstring. She kept roaring forward, but there was another huge explosion behind her. It was even louder than what she had experienced in the urban area. A huge force almost overturned her car. Her ears were buzzing, and her eardrums were hurting uncomfortably. Feng Ling's hands were still holding the steering wheel steadily. In the end, she still quickly escaped. This area was not like the city, where there was a quarantine zone. There were broken walls and debris everywhere. The huge explosion behind them was the sound of a plane falling from an unknown place. This should be the explosion zone that they said was filled with a lot of chemicals, because the ground here was no longer yellow luss, but charred black. There was even a strange substance mixed in the black, like some kind of chemical substance condensed in the air, and fell on the hot ground at that time, condensing into tiny grayish-green ice crystals. Seeing the black ground, Feng Ling suddenly stopped the car, got out of the car to carefully observe those things, and then checked for any suspicious existences nearby. When she walked to the river, she saw that the place where the weeds should have been growing was now black and bare. She gently touched it with her foot, and some charred black things fell into the river. She turned back, picked up a stone, and threw it into the river. After checking the depth of the water in the river, Feng Ling turned her gaze downstream, which was the direction of the waterfall they mentioned. It wasn't that the people from the base hadn't come to rescue them, and the base wouldn't give up on any possibility of K and Li Nanheng surviving. They sent people several times, but the result was the same. They couldn't find any trace of them. The final conclusion was that the chemicals might have corrosive effects. And it was so hot here. Anything was possible. Perhaps after searching for so many days, they had only found 2 bodies that had long since rotted. Moreover, if they had really fallen into the river, they would have fallen into a very ancient jungle along the waterfall downstream. That kind of ancient jungle was not a place that ordinary people could enter. There might be all kinds of rare beasts, and this kind of jungle was not a place that could be survived by just learning some survival skills in the wild. Not to mention that there were beasts everywhere. There might even be some messy man-eating flowers. There were all kinds of poisonous plants on the ground at any time, and they would die at the sight of blood. At that time, even if Boss Li and Kay were really lucky enough to survive falling down the waterfall, after so many days in the jungle below, there was no possibility of them surviving. The people in the base went from searching around urgently at the beginning to gradually having no choice but to face reality. In the end, they had no choice but to withdraw all their combat power to prevent further casualties. According to Lin Cheng and Tam, this process lasted for about 4 to 5 days. 4 to 5 days. Seriously injured. Ancient jungle. The chance of survival had dropped from 1% to 0. 1%. However, there was a strong force that told Feng Ling. How could a man like him die just like that? How could he disappear from this world just like that? He was still alive. Li Nanhing must be waiting for her somewhere. After looking at all the charred areas on the ground, Feng Ling used a cut mineral water bottle to take some of the soil away. She placed it in the car and drove downstream. During this time, Tam called her and asked if she was safe. After exhorting each other, they continued to search in 3 different directions. The downstream was actually not close to the location of the incident, especially since the 2 sides of the river were not roads that could be driven normally. Even if they drove an off-road vehicle, the road was still very rugged and bumpy. When they arrived at the waterfall, the sky had already darkened. Feng Ling got out of the car and looked around. She then looked down and saw that it was indeed an endless jungle. It seemed that other than going down from the waterfall, there was no other way to go. After all, she did not know where the other side of the jungle was, so she did not know which direction to go. The night was long. Although Israel was a country at war, and everywhere was filled with smoke, the night sky here was relatively clean, and the stars twinkled. Feng Ling took out a bottle of water and a bag of biscuits from the car. She then sat by the waterfall and ate a few bites. She then stood up, patted the biscuit crumbs on her hands, and was about to go to the car to get a coat. At this moment, from the corner of her eye, she suddenly saw a winding river extending into the distance in the dense jungle under the waterfall. It might not be visible during the day, but now with the moonlight, she could see some fine shadows reflected on the river through the gaps between the leaves. If the bottom of the waterfall was not a dead spring, but a river that extended outside the jungle, then if they really fell from here, they should not be in the jungle. Instead, they should have been washed to the other side of the jungle. When the people from the base came to look for people, they stopped here. And because this was a jungle, they completely put an end to it. But what if they did not stop here at all, and continued to be washed out? Feng Ling quickly got back into the car, and searched for the nearby topographic map on the navigator in the car. Usually, the geographical location on the navigator was an important area. For an ancient jungle like this, there would only be one location marked. However, the river here could not be seen, nor was there a river drawn, but at least she could see where the other end of the jungle was. At the end, there was a small patch of blue on the map. At the end of the blue was Gorkin Farm, which was adjacent to Adafira. After setting her target there, Feng Ling closed the car door with a bang, and found the route to Gorkin Farm. She found that she could only walk along the desert on both sides of the waterway. The desert was very dangerous, and there was probably no signal. She drove to the signal station closest to Jerusalem, prepared some water and food, and bought 2 power banks and a signal booster. Then she resolutely went to Gorkin Farm. As she drove along the desert on both sides of the waterway in the middle of the night, she checked everything about Gorkin Farm, but she could not find anything. A farm whose name was shown on the map, but she could not find any specific information. Feng Ling continued to drive forward without hesitation. No matter what, even if Li Nanheng was not there, even if she had to go to other places to search, as long as there was a chance, she could not miss it. Chapter 1358. After driving for an entire night, when they arrived near the Gorkin Farm, the desert in front of them finally turned into a normal-looking farm town. However, this town seemed very barren. It was surrounded by green space, and she could see all kinds of crops. She could also see many people working hard in 2s and 3s. Feng Ling drove the car over, and found a young man with dark and yellow skin. She looked at his skin and facial bones, which were typical of this country. She then looked at the others, and found that they were all the same. It seemed like the people in this Gorkin Farm were all born and raised here, not foreigners from other countries. When the young man saw Feng Ling, he was a little confused. Feng Ling tried to talk to him in English, but the other party clearly did not understand. He turned back to chat and laugh with the old men beside him. In the blink of an eye, he left her here and ignored her. Feng Ling guessed that they might not understand English, but she did not know the language of this country. When she drove past the barren and desolate town of the Gorkin Farm, many old people and children watched from the side. Their eyes were filled with fear or curiosity. After all, this was a country at war. Everyone was afraid of any external interference. From the looks of the situation here, it should have been affected by the war. When she passed by earlier, she could see some traces of old smoke and black soil. However, this place should have been peaceful for a long time, and had not been disturbed by the war. However, the old people here were still afraid. When they saw such a large unfamiliar SUV drive in, everyone's eyes were filled with various emotions. She could not drive any further, so Feng Ling could only get out of the car. In order not to let these people be wary of her, she took out some biscuits and food from the car, and handed them to the children around her. The children were about to come over excitedly, but almost all of them were forcefully pulled back into their arms by the old people. They then pulled the children away with a guarded expression, not allowing them to approach her. Only a skinny, dark-skinned, yellow-skinned boy, who looked like he had no one to take care of him, walked over. He was probably starving. When he saw that she really wanted to give him some biscuits, he quickly took them, and stuffed them into his mouth with all his might. Feng Ling looked at him, and took out a bottle of water for him. The skinny boy took it and ate the biscuits and water desperately. After he finished the 2 bags of biscuits, he squeezed the mineral water bottle in his hand and looked at her with his bright black eyes. Finally he spoke. However, Feng Ling still couldn't understand the language. She whispered to the boy in English, "Don't you people know any English? Or, do you know other languages?" The little boy looked at her for a long time and took another sip of mineral water. Then, he looked at her with his bright black eyes. Feng Ling paused and understood his meaning. She brought him 2 bags of biscuits and 2 bottles of water. The little boy smiled happily and held the food and drinks in his arms. He suddenly said in Chinese that was not very fluent, but could barely be understood by Feng Ling. "Do you know Chinese?" Feng Ling was startled. "I will." The little boy nodded his head vigorously. Suddenly he pointed at the road in the little town. "There." "What happened there?" "There's a granny who knows Chinese." Hearing this, Feng Ling did not ask more. She nodded at the little boy gratefully and parked the car in an open space that would not affect their entry. Then, she took out some food for the little boy and asked him to watch the car for a while. She then explained that she was not a bad person and would not hurt them. She asked him to tell the people here not to be afraid of her, and then quickly walked in the direction he said. When she arrived outside the house, she did not expect to see a typical red foo character that only China would have in the yard. It looked a little old. It should have been pasted on New Year's Day. Now that many months had passed, the red and black characters had faded from the wind and sun, and it seemed that this character was written by the owner of this place. It was not very beautiful, but at least it was Chinese. Feng Ling knocked on the door. After a long time, about 4 or 5 minutes, a white-haired old man in his 70s walked out. The old man's back was very hunched, and he had to raise his head to look at her. He looked at her for a long time, staring at her skin color and hair. After a long time, he said in Chinese in surprise, "You." "Hello, Granny." "Sorry to disturb you," Feng Ling said. "I just heard that there's a granny here who knows Chinese, so I came rashly. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I have something urgent to attend to, so I had no choice but to." Seeing that she was still polite, the old granny nodded and turned unhurriedly. She walked into the yard with her walking stick. "Come in and sit." Feng Ling was very anxious, but seeing that the old granny couldn't rush her, she walked in. "Recently, this small farm is really interesting. There's actually another Chinese in a place where there's never been a Chinese." Feng Ling's brows twitched. At this moment, the old granny turned to look at her. "What urgent matter do you have?" "I have a friend who was affected by the battle in Jerusalem and was seriously injured. He must have been washed down the river over there. Everyone thought he was dead. I was unwilling and couldn't accept this result. So I came all the way here and found that the end of the river was actually nearby. So I..." Feng Ling paused and reorganized her emotions and words. "I guessed that he would be here and wanted to look for him. But the people here don't speak the language, and I can't communicate in English. I didn't expect that there would be a granny who can speak Chinese. I came here when I was very young." The old granny's voice was old, and she still spoke slowly. "When I was young, at that time, we didn't have any free love. I was forced to marry by my family, and in a fit of anger I escaped. I used that bit of money to escape to Europe, and then I wandered all the way here. At that time, there were still a lot of people in this Gorkin farm. It was a very prosperous farm, but later on, the wars were too frequent. Some died and some fled, and it became desolate like this. I married a farmer here, had children, and had granddaughters. Just like this, generation after generation, we lived here. Did you come into contact with the wandering children here? Only those children would often come to my place to find food. They only know a little Chinese." Feng Ling nodded. "Yes." The old granny nodded and stood there with her walking stick. After a moment of thought, she said, "Is the person you're looking for a man?" Chapter 1359. Feng Ling's eyes trembled. She abruptly looked into the old granny's eyes. "Granny, you." The old granny raised her hand to signal her not to be anxious. "Not long ago, there was indeed a young man who was washed here by the river. He was seriously injured. There aren't any good doctors in this town. I saw that he was unconscious, but he looked Asian. I don't know which country he came from, but I asked someone to send him to an old doctor's house. It's been a few days. I haven't paid attention to him, but he should still be alive. If someone died here, everyone would know. There hasn't been any news for so many days. He should be unconscious, but he's not dead. Where is he? Feng Ling's eyes were filled with gratitude. The old granny saw her anxious look and understood. She did not say much. The doctor doesn't like to communicate with strangers. You don't speak the same language. I'll take you there. Feng Ling was really grateful. She thanked the granny many times, and went forward to support the old granny, walking out with her. This town was not big, but it was not small either. The old granny did not walk fast. Feng Ling was anxious, but she did not urge her. She patiently supported her until they arrived at the doctor's house. Although the old granny came from China, she had lived here for her entire life. She could be considered a respected old woman here. After speaking to the doctor for a while, the doctor used their language to communicate with the old granny for a while, and then let them in. When they walked into the room, the old granny turned back and said to Feng Ling, "Your friend's injuries are very serious. He has a broken leg, and seems to have been poisoned by some chemical substance. It has affected a lot of his central nervous system. Although he has woken up, his reaction is slow. He hasn't improved yet." Feng Ling's expression did not change, but her heart tightened. It was so painful that her entire body was emitting a sharp sensation. Did he break a leg? The old granny saw that she did not speak, but her face was much paler. She patted her hand comfortingly. "It's inside. Go in and take a look. I'll go greet the people here. They are very wary of outsiders. I'll let them let down their guard against you. Otherwise, it will be inconvenient for you to do anything here." "Thank you." After thanking him, Feng Ling quickly walked in. Inside was an old building with the style of a small town in this country. The light was not very bright. When Feng Ling entered, she could smell a strange medicinal smell. The people here seemed to have some Chinese medicine, but she was not sure what it was mixed with. The smell was not very pleasant. After entering, she saw a thin man lying there. Even from here, she could hear his heavy and uncomfortable breathing. Standing in front of the door, Feng Ling immediately recognized him. It was Kay. Feng Ling quickly walked over, leaned over the bed, and looked at the person on the bed. Kay's face was so thin that it was almost unrecognizable. His eyes were lifeless, and it seemed that his reactions were much slower. There was a leg under the quilt, and the other leg was empty. Feng Ling's heart trembled, and her hands were almost unsteady. She forced herself to control her emotions, and looked at the person, who seemed to have finally recognized her. "Feng Ling." Kay's eyes were very surprised, but his expression was very slow. It seemed that even speaking was very difficult for him. "It's me, Kay." Feng Ling's eyes were hot. She quickly took his hand and held it in her hand. "You can recognize me." Kay looked at her in a daze, and then as if thinking of something, he suddenly sighed with a smile. "I can't believe I can still live see an acquaintance. What nonsense are you talking about? The people in the base have been looking for you everywhere. Even if everyone thinks that there is no chance for you to survive, they have been looking for you. And our sniper team, we also came out to look for you. Didn't I find you now?" Feng Ling clenched his hand tightly. "It doesn't matter if you have a broken leg, as long as you are still alive. There are also many members in our base who were seriously injured during missions. Look, aren't they still in the base? As long as you are alive, it doesn't matter. You don't have to comfort me." Kay smiled weakly and then frowned. "Right now, there is no difference between being alive and being dead. Don't talk nonsense." Kay looked at her again and thought of something. His eyes suddenly dimmed. "Have you found Boss?" Feng Ling couldn't hold back the smile that she forced out of her eyes just now. She collapsed and her expression was a little stiff. Looking at her expression, Kay sighed and closed his eyes. "It's all my fault. Originally, Boss could have escaped. He did it to save me. Then at the waterfall, Boss caught me, but we were too weak. I asked him to let go, but he didn't let go. Boss fell down with me. At that time, Boss was more seriously injured than me. after falling down. I don't know if the two of us were washed out by that river together. At that time, the river was too turbulent, and Boss and I both fainted. Later, I don't know why I woke up in this place. I don't understand the people here, but it seems that they saved me, but I can't ask where Boss is. Since you can find me, have you found Boss? Kay almost used all his strength to barely say these coherent words. He held Feng Ling's hand tightly, only hoping to hear good news. Sure enough, he was washed down by the waterfall. But if this was the case, he might have died in the turbulent river in the jungle, or he might have been blocked by some stones or water plants in the water, and failed to be washed out. Or, there were all kinds of possibilities. Feng Ling endured the pain of being cut by a knife all over her body and heart, and slowly, she shook her head. Kay instantly closed his eyes in pain. It's all my fault. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have been so impulsive, and Boss wouldn't have. All right, don't say this. It's enough that he is still alive. Feng Ling held his hand. I will look for him. Do you remember Roger's Snow Mountain? At that time, there was almost no chance of survival in that ice cave. But he came out. His vitality and perseverance don't allow him to die. I will find him. Don't worry. Take good care of your wounds and don't think too much. Kay looked at him with reddened eyes. Feng Ling said coldly. Don't tell me how serious his injuries were. Since you're still alive, he can also survive. Even if it's more serious than yours. Even if his limbs are broken. Even if he's crippled. I'll still find him and bring him back. Kay choked with sobs and couldn't speak for a long time. He just closed his eyes and nodded. Chapter 1360. Tam and Lin Cheng met up at the place they had agreed on. But they didn't see Feng Ling. It wasn't easy for them to contact her when their phones finally had a signal. After all, there were people living in the Gorkin farm where Feng Ling was. Although the cell phone signal here was weak, it could at least keep in touch with them. After explaining the situation here, Tam and Lin Cheng were overjoyed and saddened at the same time. They were happy that they had found Kay. Their brother was still alive. Even if he had lost a leg, his brother was here. They had to bring him back to Los Angeles. The sad thing was that in a place like the Gorkin farm, this was their last chance of survival. But there was no news of Bosley. If it was really as Feng Ling had said on the phone, the worst outcome would be that after Li Nanheng came down from the waterfall, he would be intercepted in the river in the ancient jungle. When he was washed away in the river, Kay, who was near the Gorkin farm, could at least be rescued. If he was intercepted in the jungle, with Li Nanheng's body covered in injuries, he would only attract beasts that came to hunt for prey. If that was really the case, not to mention the possibility of survival, he probably wouldn't even have a complete corpse. Tam and Lin Cheng planned to come to the Gorkin farm, but just as they were about to drive over, the area near Jerusalem was under martial law because of the terrorist attacks in the past 2 days. The martial law extended all the way to their current location, and they were not allowed to leave Jerusalem. Feng Ling reported to them that she was safe, and said that she would stay here to take care of Kay. She told them not to worry, and to wait for her to return. She also promised to keep in touch with them. They had no choice. Right now they were under martial law and could not come out for the time being. They could only wait there anxiously. Kay woke up after a nap. Feng Ling went to the bed to help him up, and prepared to feed him medicine. When she helped him up, she touched Kay's shoulder, and could clearly feel how much he had lost in the past few days. His shoulders, which used to be very strong, were now so thin that she could easily feel his bones. Come take the medicine, Feng Ling said softly. Kay seemed to be in a daze. After a long time, he looked at the light outside the window. After a while he slowly said, Is it another day? Yes. Still haven't found Boss. No. Feng Ling's expression was impassive. She lowered her head to blow at the medicine in the bowl. The doctor here uses some local medicine. I don't know what it is, but since he can save your life, it means that their medicine is also useful. It just doesn't smell good. Bear with it and drink all of this. Kay closed his eyes and leaned back against her shoulder. I'm fine. There's no taste in my mouth right now. I can't feel whether it's sweet, salty, or bitter. The Chinese mother-in-law had asked the doctor for her, and the doctor said that Kay was poisoned by a chemical. They didn't know what kind of chemical it was, but it could affect one's 5 senses. He only lost his sense of taste, and his reaction was slow, which was already not bad. It was much better than being mute, blind, and deaf. Because they didn't know what kind of poison it was, there was no way to treat it. They didn't know if he would have a chance to recover in the future. In short, what they had to do now was to let him recover and save his life first. Feng Ling carefully fed Kay the medicine. Kay had to use all his strength to drink a bowl of medicine, even if he was sitting on the bed. In the end, he sat there weakly and looked at Feng Ling. For convenience, she specially asked for a long cloth from the old lady and tied her long hair behind her head. Because she didn't change her clothes last night, the old lady brought her a set of local cotton linen clothes. It was light blue and looked very good on her. Feng Ling, you've really changed a lot. Kay tried his best to widen his listless eyes and looked at her. In the past when you were in the base and now, you're really 2 different people. Feng Ling lowered her head, put down the medicine bowl, and then quickly wiped the medicine stains on his mouth with a towel. Other than the appearance, what else is different? Your eyes. Kay slowly curved his lips. You may not feel it, but really your eyes have changed a lot. Really? In the past, your eyes were very clean. In your world, there was only one goal, to live well. Later there were feelings, warmth, and things you cared about in your eyes. Later, after you returned to the Feng family, there were many things holding you back. Your eyes were filled with the struggle, helplessness, depression, and forbearance that all normal people would have. Although you're still the same you've changed a lot. At least, you're no longer the little Feng Ling, who was inexperienced in the world. Feng Ling sneered. You're only a few years older than me, and you say I'm inexperienced? Kay also smiled. I'm just older than you. Look, we were still teenagers back then, but now we're all grown up. Feng Ling curved her lips. All right, let's not talk about the past. Rest well. I'll go out for a walk. Kay knew that she wanted to go out to see if there was any possibility of finding Li Nanheng, so he did not force her to stay. He only said, be careful. After leaving the place where Kay and the doctor lived, Feng Ling drove around the Gorkin farm. Today was the 2nd day she had been here. It was already evening. There were many locals washing things near the river in front of them. The way of life of the people here was very ancient and simple. Their water source was this river, so when Kay was washed here, he was immediately discovered. She could not drive any closer. Feng Ling parked the car in the open space by the Gorkin farm town and walked over. She saw someone washing clothes by the water. When she turned back, she saw a young girl in her 20s washing things. There seemed to be a lot of blood on her clothes. Looking at the bloodstains, Feng Ling subconsciously walked over. However, when the girl saw someone approaching, she suddenly raised her eyes to look at her. Seeing that it was a stranger who did not look like a local, she immediately lowered her head warily. She put the unwashed clothes into the basin and turned to wash them in a place further away. Feng Ling saw that she did not seem to want to be approached, so she did not go over. She only looked at the young girl from afar. This girl looked like she was mixed race. But didn't the China mother-in-law say that she had already greeted the people here, and that they would no longer be wary of her? Why did this girl seem to be carefully guarding against something? Chapter 1361. Feng Ling drove around the river overnight and went to the jungle. She found that this jungle was really different from the jungle she had lived in when she was young. One was near the sea, but it was still a jungle close to the beach. No matter what, it wouldn't be as dangerous as the ancient jungle. For example, the jungle in front of her was indeed as they said. There might be all kinds of things that ordinary people had never seen or heard of in their lives, be it objects or living creatures. She wandered outside for half a night and tried to use the flashlight to shine inside. Several times, she wanted to go in, but her rationality told her that this jungle wasn't something she could barge into. However, if Li Nanheng was really inside, if she wanted to go in, she had to ensure that every step was foolproof. She couldn't drive in. At the very least, she had to be fully prepared. Feng Ling stayed outside until late at night before returning to Gorkin Farm. In the middle of the night, Kay was still sleeping. After visiting Kay, Feng Ling returned to her mother-in-law's place in China. The China mother-in-law's surname was Mai. The people here called her by her name. If Feng Ling wasn't used to it, she could call her Granny Mai. Feng Ling didn't want to disturb Granny Mai late at night. She could sleep in the car for the night, but she had to prepare the things she needed to enter the jungle. The longer she delayed, the more uneasy she felt. She decided to return to her mother-in-law's place and prepare things for herself overnight. Thankfully, Granny Mai slept soundly and didn't disturb her. It wasn't until 4 in the morning that Granny Mai woke up and saw Feng Ling sitting in the yard cutting something with a knife. She walked out to see her. "Are you preparing to enter the jungle?" What are you cutting?" "It's nothing. I just found some sturdy bamboo and sticks to make something for myself to defend myself. After I'm done, I'll put it in the car. I'll need it." Feng Ling was still seriously cutting and spoke without raising her head. Granny Mai looked at her for a while and sighed. She walked over and sat down beside her. "Child, listen to Granny's advice. There's no way to return from that ancient jungle. Don't go. You're such a good child. Granny doesn't want you to." Feng Ling did not explain much. She asked her about the Gorkin farm, as well as if there were any other rivers, water sources, and other places that she could change her target. However, the answer she received was no. The Gorkin farm was at the end of the river. If Kay and Li Nanheng had been washed here, as long as they were not intercepted in the middle of the river, they would definitely have reached this place. There would not have been any other place. Feng Ling completely dispelled her other thoughts and nodded without saying anything. Just as the sky gradually brightened, the doctor suddenly sent news that Kay had a seizure. It was probably because of what happened before and after the accident that he kept having nightmares. Right now, he was not very awake and had been desperately trying to get out of bed. He fell off the bed several times and hit anyone he saw. He was in a very bad state. Hearing this, Feng Ling quickly put down the things in her hands and rushed to the doctor. When she arrived, Kay was still sitting on the ground by the bed going crazy. Feng Ling quickly rushed over to talk to him and told him many things about Kay's past. Only then did he gradually calm down. In the end, he was finally willing to be helped back to the bed by her. He had recovered from the fright, and his twitching body gradually calmed down. Kay was in such a state and could not leave his side for the time being. The doctor asked her to stay here to guard him, although Feng Ling was anxious to go to the jungle to look for Li Nanheng. Seeing that Kay was in such a state, she could not leave. She could only sit by the bed and guard him. In the morning, Granny Mai tidied up the things that Feng Ling had cut in the courtyard and placed them on the stone table in the courtyard. At this moment, a young girl suddenly walked in. "Grandma, I forgot how to add water to the Chinese porridge you taught me before. Quickly teach me again." Granny Mai looked at Granny Mai. The girl who came was Granny Mai's granddaughter, Carrie. She was only 22 years old this year. Their family had a lot of residences in the Gorkin farm. Carrie had long moved to a new yard by herself. She grew flowers and grass on her own and lived a carefree life. This granddaughter was usually obedient and considerate, so Granny Mai did not worry too much. "Don't you like Chinese-style porridge? Why do you suddenly want to make porridge?" Granny Mai asked in confusion. Carrie did not explain. She walked in and found the kitchen. She took out the pot and the white rice from Granny Mai and walked to the yard to show her. "Grandma, I'll take the white rice here first. If you can still receive white rice in the next few days, remember to leave 2 bags for me." Granny Mai was even more puzzled. Before she could speak, she heard Carrie muttering softly as she added water to the pot in the yard. "It shouldn't be a problem to have more water, right? His injuries are so serious. The thicker the liquid food, the better." Although Granny Mai was old, her hearing was very good. She immediately glanced at her, but when she saw that Carrie was only muttering softly, she did not say much. She took the white rice and asked how much water she needed to add. Then, she took the white rice and pot and left with a worried expression. She knew her granddaughter very well. This child had been very obedient since she was young and never lied. When she was young, she would hide her gaze from adults because she had secretly eaten a piece of candy. Just now, Carrie's gaze was a little evasive. Granny Mai did not say anything. She tidied up the things in the yard, and suddenly recalled that the friend Feng Ling was looking for did not seem to be the young man named K, who was currently with the doctor, but someone else. In the afternoon, seeing that Feng Ling was still at K's place, Granny Mai first went to the doctor to ask about the situation. When she learned that Feng Ling was still guarding K, she did not say anything and went straight to her granddaughter Carrie's place. Carrie's yard was very clean, and there were many flowers she liked planted in the yard. However, in her yard, there were a few washed towels, gauze, and men's clothes on the drying rack that usually only had 1 or 2 beautiful linen dresses hanging on it. Seeing that there were men's clothes, Granny Mai's expression instantly turned cold. She walked in with her walking stick. Coincidentally, Carrie came out with a basin of bloodstained bedsheets. When she suddenly saw her grandmother, her expression froze in fright, and she quickly closed the door behind her. "Carrie, tell Grandma, are you hiding someone here?" Granny Mai walked over with a frown and looked at her granddaughter sternly. Carrie bit her lip and turned to look at the things on the drying rack. She then looked at the blood-stained bedsheets in the basin in her arms and knew that she could no longer hide it. She quickly explained, "Grandma, didn't we save someone at the river that day? Later, when I went to wash the clothes at night, I saw another person lying on the grass by the river bank." Chapter 1362. Feng Ling was still at K's place. Tam and Lin Qing called several times. She said that she could hold on, but in fact, after returning from the jungle last night, she was a little exhausted. She was afraid that Li Nanheng was really inside. She would rather go in and find nothing. As long as he was not intercepted by the water grass in the river in the jungle, as long as he had other chances of survival, she was willing to go into the jungle and never return. Seeing that K was still having nightmares in his sleep and clutching the blanket from time to time, Feng Ling placed her hand on K's body and gently patted him. She lowered her head several times to comfort him warmly, pulling him back to reality from his nightmares. The doctor came in again, gave her the medicine, and asked her to feed it to K. During the feeding, K woke up. His eyes were a little blurry. Feng Ling coaxed and comforted him before feeding him all the medicine. In the end, there was only a little left. He really couldn't eat anymore. She held the medicine bowl with one hand and took a towel with the other to wipe his mouth. At this moment, Granny Mai walked in with her walking stick. When she came in, she saw that she was still taking care of K. She suddenly recalled what she had just learned from Carrie and couldn't help but sigh. "Granny." Feng Ling turned back to see that it was Granny Mai. She quickly turned back. "You didn't throw away the things I made this morning, did you?" "No, I've tidied them up and placed them in the yard, but I feel that you might not need them." Granny Mai hesitated for a moment. Although her granddaughter had specially begged her not to tell anyone, she couldn't watch Feng Ling die in the jungle to find her friend. She sighed and said, "At that time, there was another person who was washed over by the river with your friend called K." Feng Ling's hand that was gripping the edge of the medicine bowl tightened. She abruptly raised her eyes to look at her mother-in-law. "But we didn't find that person, and only saved this one. Later, when my granddaughter Carrie went to the river to wash clothes, she found that person. At that time, he was also on the verge of death. It's also my fault. I've always spoiled my granddaughter too much, so her personality has become so bold and willful. In the past few years, she has learned some medical skills from the doctor in this town, but she's not very good. However, she felt that the doctor could save K, so she picked up another person and brought him back. She could also save him. She quietly brought him back to her place. After so many days, I actually didn't notice. I only found out today." Feng Ling's expression changed from a daze to a light in her eyes. "You only found out today? You mean that person is still alive?" Granny Mai hesitated for a moment before saying, "I didn't see him. Carrie said that she did save that person's life, but that person was the same as your friend. He seemed to have been poisoned by chemicals and only woke up after a few days. Although he's awake now, his body is severely injured and he's very weak. Although he's not crippled or broken, he can't see. At this moment, Kay vaguely heard Granny Mai's voice. He slowly opened his eyes and turned to look in their direction. He was no longer shocked and looked much calmer. He looked at Granny Mai and then at Feng Ling, who was standing by the bed. Feng Ling! Feng Ling's fingers that were pinching the edge of the bowl almost turned white. Under those circumstances, he fell down the waterfall at the same time as Kay, and was washed here. They both had symptoms of chemical poisoning. Other than Li Nanheng, there was no one else. He was still alive. He was not eaten by wild beasts in the jungle. He was still alive. His eyes can't see. What do you mean? Kay lay on the bed and said hoarsely. However, before he could finish his words, Feng Ling suddenly put down the medicine bowl in her hand and walked out. As she walked, she said, "Granny, take me to him." Seeing that Feng Ling was so anxious, Granny Mai sighed, nodded and turned to walk out. However, because her legs were really slow, and seeing that Feng Ling was really anxious this time, she simply pointed the way for her. "It's at my granddaughter Carrie's place. I'm walking too slowly. You can go there by yourself first. It's just ahead, where I live." On the right side of the road opposite, there's a courtyard with many flowers. It's her place. The clothes you see hanging in the courtyard should be your friend. If there's no mistake, it should be the person you're looking for. Thank you. Feng Ling hurriedly turned back to thank her, and then ran without stopping. She first ran back to Granny Mai's residence according to the familiar route, and then walked in the direction of the fork Granny Mai had mentioned. When she reached the right side, she began to look for the courtyard she had mentioned. After walking for nearly 100 meters, she finally saw a beautiful and clean courtyard with many flowers. Although the door to the courtyard was closed, there was still a gap. With a gentle push, it opened. When she looked up, the first thing she saw was the man's shirt and trousers. Although the clothes were covered with burn marks from the explosion, she could recognize that it was Li Nanheng's clothes. So he was here. She was not wrong. She had been at the Gorkin farm for 2 days. It turned out that he was only a few hundred meters away from her. He was still alive, breathing, and she could still hear news of him. Feng Ling forcefully suppressed the frequency of her hands and feet trembling with excitement. She calmly walked into the courtyard. When she walked in, she seemed to hear coughing coming from the house. The coughing sounded intermittent and very low. She couldn't tell if it was a simple cough or something. But that voice was indeed a very hoarse man's voice. Feng Ling abruptly walked to the door, and saw that it was locked from the inside. She then looked around for the window, but after searching for a long time, she couldn't find any window that was open. The women in the Gorkin farm had a habit of protecting themselves, especially unmarried girls. They wouldn't casually reveal everything in the window. Feng Ling simply knocked on the door. After knocking for a long time, she finally heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and the young girl she had seen by the river appeared. When she looked up to see Feng Ling, Carrie was shocked. Sorry to disturb you. I'm looking for Li Nanheng. Feng Ling looked straight into her eyes. If she wasn't Granny Mai's granddaughter, she might have pushed her away and barged in. Carrie seemed unfamiliar with Li Nanheng's name. She looked at her strangely. Are you the person my grandmother took in? Isn't the friend you're looking for at the doctor's place? The person in the doctor's room is indeed my friend, but the man in your room is my fiancé. His name is Li Nanheng. Feng Ling still looked into her eyes, and her words revealed a hint of sharpness that could not be ignored. Chapter 1363. The word fiancé caused Carrie's eyelids to twitch. Her expression turned cold. The person you're looking for isn't here. With that, she was about to close the door. Wait! Feng Ling raised her hand to press against the door that was about to be closed. She looked at the young girl. Granny Mai has been kind to me. She has taken me in for the past 2 days. You're her granddaughter, so I should be very polite to you. But you can't hide a seriously injured person in your own place. Have you ever thought that if he has a chance to survive, but delays the treatment? This is no longer equivalent to saving people, but harming their lives. What are you talking about? What delay the treatment? Carrie's expression was unhappy. Anyway, I don't have the person you're talking about here. Take your hand away. Let me tell you, in our place you're an outsider. If it weren't for my grandmother, you would have been chased away long ago. If you dare to barge into my house, I'll go out and call everyone over right now. Let's see if the people here will still keep you." With that, Carrie forcefully pulled her hand down and slammed the door shut. At the same time, they could hear the sound of the door being locked from the inside again. Feng Ling looked at the tightly shut door in front of her, and her expression darkened. It was indeed because of Granny Mai that the people in this town trusted her. However, she was an outsider after all, so even if the people here would not chase her away, they would carefully avoid her when they saw an outsider. If she did anything impulsive here, Carrie, who had grown up here, would definitely be chased away to protect her. Kay was still here, and so was Li Nanheng. She couldn't be rash, especially since Carrie was Granny Mai's granddaughter. If it weren't for Granny Mai, she wouldn't have known about this. However, right now, she really wished she could kick open the door in front of her and rush in to see how badly Li Nanheng was injured. Feng Ling stood outside the door for a long time. She raised her hand and knocked a few more times. This time, Carrie couldn't even be bothered to respond. She did not make a sound. After about 10 minutes, Feng Ling heard a cough again. She shivered and hurriedly walked back and forth in the direction of the sound. Finally, she walked near the closed window. The sound was the clearest one she had heard recently. She pressed her hand against the window. The coughing just now was intermittent, but now she could not hear it anymore. His hand on the window was a little cold, contrary to the hot temperature in this place. It was very quiet inside. She didn't know if Li Nanheng was awake or unconscious. Granny Mai finally rushed over. Seeing Feng Ling standing outside the window, deep in thought, she immediately understood something and rushed over. "How is it? You didn't see your friend?" Feng Ling turned to look at her, and then raised her finger to point at the clothes on the drying rack. "That's his clothes. I heard a cough inside. It must be him. Granny, I can't rashly enter your granddaughter's house. I can tell that she doesn't welcome me. She locked the door. But if she locked my friend inside just to prove her medical skills, it's not fair to us. Granny, please help me." Granny Mai's expression immediately changed. "Nonsense." With that, she frowned and turned to the door. She raised her hand and knocked on the door. Carrie opened the door. It was quiet inside for a while. "Carrie, Grandma is going to be angry," Granny Mai said unhappily. "The person inside is Miss Feng's friend. She's seriously injured. Don't mess around." Finally, Carrie's voice came from inside. "Grandma, that woman is lying. I asked him, and he said he doesn't know anyone surnamed Li, nor does he know the woman outside. Either she's mistaken, or she's lying. Grandma, it's so unsafe outside. How can you let a stranger stay here? Since she's already found that friend, she's still finding all sorts of reasons not to leave. I think she must have some other motive." Granny Mai was startled. Feng Ling shook her head when she turned to look at her. Granny Mai sighed and knocked on the door again. "Open the door first, and let her in to take a look. If it's really not her friend, she won't do anything to you. She'll leave immediately." "No. His injuries haven't healed yet. He can't be exposed to the wind." Carrie's voice was very unhappy and impatient. "Grandma, don't bring a stranger here. I saved him and even woke him up. This means that there's no problem with the medicine I used. Furthermore, he can't see right now. If that woman comes in and insists that she knows him, and he can't see who she is, it's not fair to him. I won't let her in. You child." And he clearly said that he doesn't know the woman outside. Why should he let her in? He's already injured. If she brings in any dirty things or bacteria, it won't be good for him. Carrie raised her voice. "Grandma, quickly take her away. Don't let her come again." Feng Ling said. "Miss Carrie, you know the situation of my friend at the doctor's place. They were all poisoned by the chemical smoke, and have all sorts of symptoms. His eyes and his inability to remember me might only be temporary. No matter what he has forgotten, it might just be a symptom. Let me take a look at him. I can tell with one look that he is." "Stop lying. He didn't forget anything. When he woke up, he told me the reason why he was injured. Although he's very weak now, his words are clear, and he's always been sober. It's just that his eyes can't see. If he says he doesn't know you, then he doesn't know you." Carrie's tone was still unyielding. Feng Ling couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe it either. His words were clear? His memory was clear? How could he not remember her? It was impossible. She turned to look at the clothes hanging on the hanger outside. She walked over and took the clothes down. She looked at the material and size of the clothes, and then at the scorch marks on them. This was Li Nanheng's clothes. The only person who could be rushed to Gorkin Farm with Kay was Li Nanheng. There couldn't be anyone else. If she didn't lie, then the one who lied was someone else. Could Li Nanheng refuse to meet her when he knew she was here, and even say that he didn't know her? The only person who lied was this Carrie. But why did she lie? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.